Radio Westeros, Episode 95, Bran Stark, Part 2.
Spoilers all books!
Hello and welcome to Radio Westeros. I'm Lady Guinevere, and with me, as always, is Yoke Boy.
Hello there! This episode is the second installment of our three-part series on Bran Stark, covering Bran's arc in A Clash of Kings from the arrival of not one but two Walder Freys in the aftermath of his mother's agreement with the Lord of the Crossing to Bran's departure from his childhood home in the final chapter of the book.
And as we'll see, a major theme of Bran's arc in A Clash of Kings is dreams, and we'll learn about the different types of dreams that Bran has, as well as getting a look at the dreams of a couple of other characters, from the greendreams of Jojen Reed to the nightmares of Theon Greyjoy.
We'll also see Bran established as a character who observes rather than participates, something that will play a huge role in his upcoming arc. As such, we'll catch up on all the goings-on in the north during Robb's absence in the south. Bran will be our window onto the very important early positioning of the Northern Lords for what will come next, essentially laying the groundwork for theories about Northern resistance that may be taking place in A Dance with Dragons.
And speaking of groundwork, we'll also see part of the early moves by House Bolton as they position themselves to be handed control of the North after Robb's murder, not to mention some of the earliest hints at that act in the story. So, all that and more today. But before we begin, we want to give a quick shout out to all of our patrons who help keep Radio Westeros going, including our Flaming Lightbringer patron, TJ Harrington, our Dragonsteel patrons, Peter and Maltude, and Pale as Milk Glass patrons, Alex, Akka in the Company of the Cats, Crispy, the Song of Ice, Kelly, Sister Winter, Empty Walls, First of His Name, and John Wergarian, as well as B-Word and Mr. J, the Bear and the Maiden Fair, and Sir Tim of House Jib Jab Hot Dog Shop. House motto, we forge the chains we wear in life.
And if you want to help keep Radio Westeros going strong, please consider becoming a patron of the show. You'll gain ad-free access to episodes up to a week before they go public, as well as exclusive content, personalized shoutouts, and more. Find out more by visiting patreon.com/Radio Westeros. And now, let's get started with our look at Bran Stark in A Clash of Kings. When the darkness closed over him, he found himself in the Godswood, moving silently beneath green-grey sentinels and gnarled oaks as old as time. I am walking, he thought, exulting. Part of him knew that it was only a dream. But even the dream of walking was better than the truth of his bedchamber, walls and ceiling and door.
The predominant theme in Bran's A Clash of Kings arc is dreams, specifically for Bran, his wolf dreams, which he at first doesn't understand. As we'll hear in his first chapter, he also sometimes dreams about a tree calling his name. However, we'll eventually learn that most of Bran's dreams are technically skin-changing, while soon enough, a new arrival at Winterfell will introduce the idea of green dreams, which are prophetic in nature.
Another major aspect of Bran's arc in Clash is his use as a camera character to convey relevant developments in the North. In Clash, Bran is gradually established as a character who watches and can therefore convey important information to the reader without having to participate in the action himself, which is a novel way for the author to utilize a character who has little to no agency due to age and physical disability.
Camera perspective can benefit from a character's limited knowledge, in this case due to Bran's age, to present an objective view, or at least one that isn't biased by the observer's thoughts or feelings, which is quite unlike what we see in many of George's other characters' viewpoints, including Bran's sisters, who are also children, albeit somewhat older. As a device, camera perspective can also serve to obscure important twists or reveals that the author isn't ready to share with the reader.
As far as that goes, as a young child who doesn't have much agency in the plot due to his circumstances, using Bran more as an observer than a participant in events may have solved two problems for George. First, of course, is what to do with Bran, whom he has admitted is the hardest character for him to write. The second problem is the result of Cat going away, which apparently wasn't George's original plan.
Yeah, in an interview in 2000, George gave Catelyn credit for driving her own plot. Originally, he had planned for her to remain at Winterfell, quote, kind of as a ruler of the North when Ned went south. But when he began writing the Catspaw storyline, he realized that Cat would never send a messenger to Ned in King's Landing as he had intended. Rather, he thought, Catelyn wouldn't do that. Someone had tried to kill her child. She wouldn't send a letter and take this minor character as the messenger. That was something she was going to do herself.
And so Cat went south, on a journey from which she would ultimately never return. That left Bran as George's sole northern POV for almost all of Clash. And so Bran, 7 years old, unable to walk, and forbidden to travel beyond the walls of the North's great castle, had to become an observer and the mechanism by which readers would learn what was happening at Winterfell and beyond in the absence of Lord and Lady Stark and their 3 eldest children.
But setting Bran up as a watcher functions on another, more important level. Bran's arc in A Storm of Swords and A Dance with Dragons will deal with him becoming a window into the past, as well as the present, with strong hints that observing the future may even be on the table. And so establishing this function for him as a character now serves to inform where his arc is going.
Bran's first chapter establishes him as a watcher in its first lines. Bran preferred the hard stone of the window seat to the comforts of his feather bed and blankets. A bed the walls pressed close and the ceiling hung heavy above him. A bed the room was his cell and Winterfell his prison. Yet outside his window the wide world still called. So Bran in his window seat literally gives us a window onto what's happening in Winterfell and beyond. And the theme continues when it says, he liked to watch the windows begin to glow all over Winterfell as candles and hearth fires were lit behind the diamond-shaped panes of tower and hall.
And that line continues, and he loved to listen to the direwolves sing to the stars, which is offered as a segue to the idea of wolf dreams in the next line. Of late, he often dreamed of wolves. The reader knows, or will soon learn, that these dreams are common with not only Bran, but with his siblings who also dream from their wolves' perspectives.
Speaking of wolves' perspectives, both Summer and Shaggy Dog had been confined to the Godswood after Shaggy bit the newly arrived little Walder Frey, one of the 2 fosterlings Catelyn had agreed to take from the Lord of the Crossing in Cat 9 of A Game of Thrones. They had recently arrived at Winterfell and so far had failed to ingratiate themselves with Prince Bran. In fact, in light of the future arc of House Frey, Shaggy's aggressive response has to make one wonder if they know Freys are bad, similar to what we'll see with Grey Wind's reaction to Sir Rolf Spicer in A Storm of Swords.
For his part, Bran struggles to understand why the wolves constantly howl and thinks he could, quote, almost understand them, as if they were singing in a language he had once known and somehow forgotten. That particular passage continues with some insight, cloaked as the superstition of an old woman, from Old Nan, who tells him that the Starks have wolf blood, though she qualifies her statement with a warning. It is stronger in some than in others.
Failing to understand what Summer and Shaggy are howling about, Bran resorts to asking the adults around him what they think. Bran senses that Summer's howls are sad, full of grief and longing, while Shaggy's are more savage, perhaps mirroring the anger we've seen from little Rickon at the loss of their family members. Sir Roderick Cassell, who had ordered the wolves confined, simply says, "Who can know the mind of a wolf?" while Farlan the kennel master, who had never approved of the wolf pups in the first place, suggests they're calling for their freedom. They don't like being walled up, and who's to blame them? Wild things belong in the wild, not in a castle.
Gage the cook suggests they want to hunt, while Lewin offers a perspective that leads to Bran wondering about something else. Wolves often howl at the moon. These are howling at the comet. See how bright it is, Bran? Perchance they think it is the moon. When Bran repeats Lewin's words to Asha, wondering what she thinks, her reply is, "Your wolves have more wit than your maester. They know truths the grey man has forgotten."
Sensing something else behind this statement, Bran asks Osha what she thinks the comet means. Her answer is nothing short of foreboding. Blood and fire, boy, and nothing sweet. Of course, Septon Shale correlates the comet with the recent arrival of the White Raven, announcing the beginning of autumn, saying, "It is the sword that slays the season." But old Nan, who's lived through more years and more seasons than anyone, seems to agree with Osha. Here's the passage. "Dragons," she said, lifting her head and sniffing. She was near blind and could not see the comet, yet she claimed she could smell it. "It be dragons, boy," she insisted.
The comet has by this time been observed in multiple other point of view chapters, with perhaps the most significant, as far as Old Nan's and Asha's suggestion, being Dany 10 of A Game of Thrones, in which 3 dragons hatch as the comet is seen in the sky above the Dothraki Sea. Could the wolves somehow be aware of this change in the natural world?
Adding to the general sense of mystery created by all of these observations, when Bran looked at the comet from his window, he could also see the rooftops of Winterfell with the tower of the First Keep prominent in the background. The rooftops, of course, remind him of his past, climbing freely to places known only to himself until his fall. It says he did not remember falling, but also that the sight of the First Keep and its gargoyles gave him a, quote, queer tight feeling in his belly.
And this train of thought brings him back to the wolves howling as they had done when he lay in his coma. He wonders if they're mourning as they had done for him after his injury, for Lady, when Robb departed with Greywind, and for his father. Bran's anxiety for his family's safety takes center stage for a moment until, frustrated at nearly understanding their cries, he decides to join in, and soon his own boy howls are answered by both Summer and Shaggy Dog.
When he refuses to stop, his guard sends for Maester Lewin, who arrives to tell him that he must sleep. Bran declines to go to bed and tells Lewin, "When I sleep, I turn into a wolf," which he follows up with a question, "Do wolves dream?" Lewin gives a typical scholar's response that likely all creatures dream, but not like men do, of course. Bran then wants to know if dead men dream, thinking of his father, which of course Lewin cannot answer. He follows up with a third query. Do trees dream?
Lewin seems nonplussed by this question, offering a hesitant "no," which Bran greets with a certainty of his own. "They do. They dream tree dreams. I dream of a tree sometimes, a weirwood like the one in the Godswood. It calls to me. The wolf dreams are better. I smell things, and sometimes I can taste the blood."
Lewin, now clearly disturbed by the turn the conversation has taken, suggests that Bran should spend more time with the other children, to which Bran responds heatedly, "I hate the other children. I commanded you to send them away." He's referring to the Walders, of course, and Lewin sternly reminds him that they cannot be sent away as they arrived on the orders of his mother. There follows a brief exchange about Summer and Shaggy's behaviour and the unfairness of their confinement. Perhaps the Walders could be confined to the Godswood, Bran suggests, where they could play their game to their heart's content.
Bran, it turns out, is chafing against his own confinement and dreams of being free to live as a wolf, in which case he'd, quote, find Arya and Sansa, I'd smell where they were and go save them. And, he continues, when Robb went to battle, I'd fight beside him like Grey Wind. I'd tear out the Kingslayer's throat with my teeth, rip, and then the war would be over and everyone would come back to Winterfell. Upon which, Bran begins howling again, and an exasperated Luwin departs.
After Luwin leaves his chamber, Bran thinks resentfully that he had been welcoming to the Walders at first, but then came their game, which he had mentioned to Luwin moments before. The game in question is called the Lord of the Crossing, and it involves a log or plank laid across a stream as a makeshift bridge, which was then defended by a player with a stick or a staff who was called the Lord of the Crossing.
The object of the game was for the Lord to defend the crossing and prevent people from using it. It was up to the would-be crossers to make speeches to convince the Lord why they should cross. Here's Bran's description of the game. The Lord could make them swear oaths and answer questions. They didn't have to tell the truth, but the oaths were binding unless they said mayhaps. So the trick was to say mayhaps, so the Lord of the Crossing didn't notice. Then you could try and knock the Lord into the water, and you got to be Lord of the Crossing, but only if you'd said mayhaps. Otherwise, you were out of the game. The Lord got to knock anyone in the water anytime he pleased, and he was the only one who got to use a stick.
For the observant reader, the first part of the game, that of the oaths and promises that were extracted to gain the crossing, sounds extremely similar to the real-life experience of Catelyn Stark in A Game of Thrones. The second part, in which it's noted that the oaths were binding unless they were prefaced by mayhaps, is fairly foreboding in the power it gives the Lord. Failing to say mayhaps and breaking your oath would lead to you being out of the game, and it's noted that the Lord can knock anyone into the water and that he's the only one allowed to use a weapon.
In A Storm of Swords, arriving at the Twins with Robb after he broke his oath to marry one of Walder Frey's daughters, Catelyn, who, as far as we know, never said mayhaps during her initial negotiations to gain the crossing, will be greeted by a bad-tempered Lord Walder who spells it out to her and Robb. You wanted crossing, and I gave it to you, and you never said mayhaps. Heh. So, this sinister mention that Cat failed to say mayhaps, which the reader knows can lead to being out of the game, is followed by Lord Walder using the word again when Catelyn seeks the protection of his bread and salt. Food, a loaf of bread, a bite of cheese, mayhaps a sausage. Altogether, Lord Walder uses the word 3 times in succession immediately prior to the Red Wedding, and so it seems plain that in this passage of Bran 1 of Clash of Kings, George expertly lays some of the first hints to the reader that the Starks will be betrayed by the Freys, and it seems very likely that somehow Summer and Shaggy Dog could sense what was coming.
Back to Prince Bran, howling in his chamber at Winterfell. Before long, Luwin returned with Osha and a sleeping draught. He promises Bran the potion will give him a dreamless sleep, which seems quite appealing to Bran, whose thoughts have been full of the dreams that he can't seem to escape. But after she carries him to his bed, Osha remains behind to give Bran some advice. You should not fight so hard, boy. I see you talking to the heart tree. Might be the gods are trying to talk back.
Bran doesn't understand what she means by referring to the gods, but Asha is also unaware that he sometimes dreams of a tree calling to him, which would certainly support her idea that the gods are talking to him. With her words echoing in his ears, Bran falls asleep, hoping for a dreamless rest.
It was not to be. Bran's point of view changes and we get a glimpse of his dream. It says, Yet when the darkness closed over him, he found himself in the godswood, moving silently beneath green-grey sentinels and gnarled oaks as old as time. I am walking, he thought, exulting. Part of him knew that it was only a dream, but even the dream of walking was better than the truth of his bedchamber, walls and ceiling and door.
It becomes obvious that Bran is inside Summer and that the point of view we have is truly that of the wolf. We sense his anxiety at being caged and see Shaggy Dog's fury. Summer realizes they are trapped in a man made world and thinks about Winterfell outside the walls that currently hold him and his brother. Beyond Winterfell, he thinks, the true world was calling, and he knew he must answer or die.
And so Bran's first chapter ends with a wolf dream, and a sentiment that echoes this line from the first passage of the chapter. Outside his window, the wide world still called. These phrases not only highlight the urgency of events beyond Winterfell, which Bran and the reader both still remain somewhat in the dark about, but also prefigures Bran's clash arc, which, as we'll see, will end with him leaving Winterfell.
And up next, for the time being, the outside world must come to Winterfell, as we'll see in Bran 2, when Stark bannermen from across the region begin to arrive at Winterfell for a harvest feast. That night, Bran prayed to his father's gods for dreamless sleep. If the gods heard, they mocked his hopes, for the nightmare they sent was worse than any wolf dream. "Fly or die!" cried the three-eyed crow as it pecked at him. He wept and pleaded, but the crow had no pity. It put out his left eye and then his right, and when he was blind in the dark, it pecked at his brow, driving its terrible, sharp beak deep into his skull. He screamed until he was certain his lungs must burst. The pain was an axe splitting his head apart, but when the crow wrenched out its beak, all slimy with bits of bone and brain, Bran could see again. What he saw made him gasp in fear. He was clinging to a tower miles high, and his fingers were slipping, nails scrabbling at the stone, his legs dragging him down, stupid, useless, dead legs. "Help me!" he cried. A golden man appeared in the sky above him and pulled him up. "The things I do for love," he murmured softly as he tossed him out, kicking into empty air.
Bran 2 of A Clash of Kings deals primarily with the bannermen and women who begin to arrive at Winterfell ostensibly to celebrate a harvest feast. As we'll see, the feast will provide a brief moment of celebration amidst the trauma of the escalating civil war that has seized Westeros. The chapter, though, returns Bran to his role as a camera, as one by one the Stark banners arrive and we're given status updates from castles and holdfasts across the north.
But the feast has another purpose, as Sir Roderick points out. The feast makes a pleasant pretext, but a man does not cross 100 leagues for a sliver of duck and a sip of wine. Only those who have matters of import to set before us are like to make the journey. And so Prince Bran, who cannot join in the activities in the training yard as he so longs to do, is expected to sit in the Lord Solar as Robb's representative and listen to requests brought by a stream of lords while Maester Luwin and Sir Roderick negotiate on his behalf.
Bran is frustrated. He grew up dreaming of knighthood and never once dreamed of being Lord of Winterfell, much less a prince. But now he must abandon his dreams while the noxious Walders play at quintains in the yard, and he is forced to listen to, quote, old men speak of things he barely understands. Luwin telling him, "Listen, and it may be that you will learn something of what lordship is all about," is hardly any consolation, since Bran has no desire to be a lord.
But Bran is a son of Winterfell and knows deep down what his father and Robb would expect of him. And so he dresses in his finest clothes and makes his way to the Lord Solar, all with Hodor's assistance. Lord Wyman Manderley had been the first to arrive, and Bran is expected to receive him. And so he maneuvers himself into a specially modified basket that hangs from Hodor's shoulders and sets out. But he can't resist stopping to look at the action in the training yard, where he runs into the Walders, who promptly begin mocking Hodor.
Hodor, who has become both manservant and legs to Bran, is an easy target with his gentle nature and giant stature. Bran becomes angry and the scene descends into bickering, which is only stopped by Luwin's arrival. he scolds the Walders and sweeps Bran away to the audience with Lord Wyman, cautioning his young charge to speak nothing but courtesies unless Sir Roderick or Lord Wyman puts you a question.
And speaking of courtesies, Lord Wyman genially dismisses Bran's apologies for being late and launches right into the matters he is there to discuss, which it soon becomes clear are matters meant to position himself and his house at the center of Robb's realm. He begins with telling them that he's had to appoint new customs officers as the previous ones were holding the silver they collected for King's Landing rather than sending it to Robb's treasury. Keep in mind that the Crown's customs officers were, by and large, in the pay of Peter Baelish, so the men that were replaced may have also been spying for him. Lord Wyman doesn't mention this, but he does suggest that a mint be established in White Harbor where silver coinage for the king in the north could be minted.
Lord Wyman also suggested that Robb needed a war fleet, noting, "We've had no strength at sea for hundreds of years since Brandon the Burner put the torch to his father's ships," and offering to float you sufficient galleys to take Dragonstone and King's Landing both, within a year, if provided the gold to do so. This seemed like a fine idea to Bran, but Sir Roderick only promised to send the offer to Robb, and talk moved on to other, much more dull matters.
While Bran dreamed about warships and the training yard, Lord Wyman inquired after his cousin, Lady Hornwood. With her husband recently deceased at the Battle of the Green Fork and their son dead in the Battle of the Whispering Woods, she is a widow alone with valuable lands that would no doubt catch the eye of several potential suitors. Lord Wyman, a widower himself, offers to marry her unless she'd prefer his second son, Wendell, who was then in service with Lady Catelyn away in the south.
And the mention of his second son provided an opening for Lord Wyman to raise the issue of his heir, Sir Wyllis, who had been taken captive at the Green Fork and was being held at Harrenhal. Wyman had received a letter from Tywin Lannister offering his son back without a ransom if he'd withdraw his support for Robb Stark. Wyman agrees with Sir Roderick that his answer would be refusal, but indicates his strong wish to see his son ransomed and returned before too very long.
The lengthy meeting concluded in the late afternoon, leaving Bran tired, but that evening brought another arrival he must receive, Lady Hornwood herself. Bran courteously welcomes her, saying, "We are very sorry for all you have suffered, my lady," before giving her leave to rest for the evening. They would meet again the following day.
At that meeting, Lady Hornwood agreed to Lewin's suggestion that she store a quarter rather than 20% of her harvest against the coming winter. She in turn warns Winterfell that Ramsay Snow is massing men at the Dreadfort and had refused to answer her questions about his intent. Lewin and Roderick confess they know little of the young man, and she tells him what she knows. He lived with his mother until 2 years passed, when young Domeric died and left Bolton without an heir. That was when he brought his bastard to the Dreadfort. The boy is a sly creature by all accounts, and he has a servant who is almost as cruel as he is. Reek, they call the man. It's said he never bathes. They hunt together, the bastard and this Reek, but not for deer. I've heard tales, things I can scarce believe, even of a Bolton. And now that my lord husband and my sweet son have gone to the gods, the bastard looks at my lands hungrily.
Lady Hornwood also indicates that she will remarry if Robb orders it, but that her preference would be someone other than Mors Umber or Wyman Manderley. In fact, it's strongly hinted that she would look favorably upon Roderick Cassel himself before she takes her leave. When she departs, Roderick and Lewin discuss the problem of the Hornwood inheritance. Lewin says, "With no direct heir, there are sure to be many claimants contending for the Hornwood lands. The Tallhearts, Flints, and Karstarks all have ties to House Hornwood through the female line, and the Glovers are fostering Lord Harris's bastard at Deepwood Motte. The Dreadfort has no claim that I know, but the lands adjoin, and Roose Bolton is not one to overlook such a chance."
Bran urges Sir Roderick to consider marrying the lady, but he defers modestly and says the choice is up to Robb. Next, Bran suggests Lawrence Snow, Lord Hornwood's bastard, which Roderick is unwilling to contemplate yet. That would please the Glovers, and perhaps Lord Hornwood's shade as well, but I do not think Lady Hornwood would love us. The boy is not of her blood.
Lewin declares it may end up being the best solution, and Bran asks their leave to be excused so that he can visit with Summer in the Godswood. As Hodor sets him down by the pool beneath the heart tree, they're surprised by Asha bursting from beneath its surface. She'd jumped in to see if she could touch the bottom, though she doesn't admit whether she found it or not. It's the second time Bran has encountered her here, and as she dresses, she talks to Bran about the Walders and the confrontation in the training yard, offering him a warning about Little Walder. He and Hodor should watch their backs around him, she says, to which she adds, the big one they call Little, it comes to me he's well named, big outside, little inside, and mean down to the bones.
With a final question about whether he's had any more wolf dreams, to which Bran quickly answers no, she takes her leave and departs back to the kitchens. Bran himself leaves shortly afterwards, wishing she hadn't mentioned the dreams, as he was just going to bed, where he fought against sleep and dreams as usual. But when sleep finally came, it brought a tree dream rather than a wolf one. It says, on this night he dreamed of the weirwood. It was looking at him with its deep red eyes, calling to him with its twisted wooden mouth, and from its pale branches the three-eyed crow came flapping, pecking at his face and crying his name in a voice as sharp as swords.
Morning brought more new arrivals, and Bran's gratitude for an end to the dream. The Umbers had arrived, and when they came to the audience chamber, it was the Greatjohn's two uncles, Mors and Hothor. Mors lost no time requesting permission to marry Lady Hornwood, while Hothor asked for ships, telling Roderick, there's wildlings stealing down from the north, more than I've ever seen before. They cross the Bay of Seals in little boats and wash up on our shores. The crows in Eastwatch are too few to stop them, and they go round quick as weasels. It's long ships we need, aye, and strong men to sail them. The Greatjohn took too many. Half our harvest is gone to seed for want of arms to swing the sides.
Sir Roderick was quick with a suggestion that perfectly matched Lord Manderley's request to build Robb a fleet. You have forests of tall pine and old oak. Lord Manderley has shipwrights and sailors in plenty. Together you ought to be able to float enough warships to guard both your coasts. And when Mors Umber reacted with disgust, calling Lord Wyman a waddling sack of suet, Roderick snapped back. He is fat, but he is not stupid. You will work with him, or the king will know the reason why.
The Umbers agreed after some further complaining, and this will eventually become a key point to keep our eyes on when the idea of northern resistance to Bolton rule takes hold in A Dance with Dragons. The Umbers and Manderleys had been working together for some time and had good reason to be in communication, something that was likely unknown to Roose Bolton, who is neither present at this harvest feast nor fully trusted by the Stark loyalists.
While this conversation was going on, the Glovers and Tallhearts had arrived, with Galbert Glover and his brother Robert away with Robb in the south, and Robert's wife declining to attend due to her young children. House Glover was represented by a steward, who Bran surmised to be the true ruler of Deepwood Motte in its master's absence. When the steward confessed they were only setting aside 1/10 of their harvest, Roderick insisted the measure be raised to 1/5. And then he and Lewin questioned the steward about the lad Lawrence Snow, who was praised for his wit and courage.
Leopold Tallheart, the younger brother of Sir Helman, the Lord of Torrance Square, had another idea. His wife was born a Hornwood, and he lost no time suggesting that their younger son, 10-year-old Baron, might be the solution to Lady Donella's problem, a lad of Hornwood blood whom she could raise as her own and who would take the name Hornwood in exchange for becoming her heir. He also mentions that his nephew Benfred, a lad who had been friendly with Robb and Theon before the war, has formed a group of lancers composed of young men who hadn't gone to war with Robb. While he seems amused by Benford's antics, Roderick curtly tells Leopold to keep his nephew at Torrance Square as his father and the king had commanded.
Over the next several days, regrets arrive from the Dreadfort, the Mormonts and Karstarks, Old Lord Locke, Lady Liessa Flint, likely of the Flint of Flint's Fingers in the West, who gave her advanced pregnancy as an excuse, and from the Flints of Widow's Watch, where there was sickness. Soon enough, the only major houses who hadn't replied were the Reeds of Greywater Watch, whose head Howland hadn't set foot outside of his swamps for many a year, and the Kerwins, who were the Starks' closest neighbours.
And Clay Kerwin does soon arrive, the last to do so, and is received warmly by Bran. He is the son of Lord Medgar Kerwin, who was taken captive at the Green Fork and later seen by Arya at Harrenhal. The Kerwins are distant cousins to the Starks, and Bran considers Clay a friend, expressing pleasure at seeing him. Clay starts by telling Bran about Stannis' letter alleging that Joffrey is the son of the Kingslayer. But as the gossip swirls around him, it says, "For a moment, Bran felt as though he could not breathe. A giant hand was crushing his chest. He felt as though he was falling and clutched desperately at Dancer's reins."
Clay, alarmed by his reaction, insists that Stannis is nothing for Robb to worry about, which may or may not be true depending on how much stock you put in Melisandre's powers. In truth, Bran is having a reaction to the discussion of Queen Cersei bedding her brother, the Kingslayer, because it was to protect that secret that Bran was thrown from a tower window, though he does not remember the details.
And so we arrive at the final dream of the chapter, the reading we began with. Though Bran prayed for dreamless sleep that night, as ever, far from answering his prayers, that night the gods sent him a nightmare. The three-eyed crow was there, insisting that he fly or die, pecking his eyes out before driving deep into his forehead with his beak to open his third eye. With his third eye open, Bran could see, and it says what he saw made him gasp in fear as he clung to a tower miles high with his fingers slipping and crying for help. In his dreams, a golden man appeared above him and pulled him to safety, only to say softly, "The things I do for love," before tossing him out into the empty air.
Bran has remembered Jaime's push at last, inspired by Clay Kerwin's talk about the letter and the Jaime-Cersei affair. But as we'll see in the next chapter, it doesn't seem like his memory sticks with him as anything more than possibly the memory of another bad dream. Up next, it's the Harvest Feast, a little joy amidst the chaos, and the arrival of someone who knows a thing or two about dreams.
He went to sleep with his head full of knights in gleaming armor, fighting with swords that shone like starfire, but when the dream came, he was in the Godswood again. The smells from the kitchen and the great hall were so strong that it was almost as if he had never left the feast. He prowled beneath the trees, his brother close behind him. This night was wildly alive, full of the howling of the man-pack at their play. The sounds made him restless. He wanted to run, to hunt. He wanted to.
Bran 3 begins with Bran, garbed in stark white and grey, riding into the Great Hall on Dancer, similarly caparisoned. Bran had wanted to enter with Summer at his side, but Sir Roderick refused this request. Bran entering a hall on horseback seems to be in keeping with tradition, but it's also visually reminiscent of the tale Ned tells in A Game of Thrones of entering the throne room of the Red Keep on horseback in the aftermath of Jaime Lannister's murder of Aerys Targaryen.
As Bran rode the length of the hall, guests cheered, shouting, "Stark and Winterfell!" He becomes self conscious at the dais when Osha and Hodor have to lift him from Dancer's back to his father's seat. But once seated, he offered the guests a warm welcome in the name of his brother and offers a toast to Robb's victories and to the harvest. Guests cheer, and both Roderick and Luwin praise his performance. And then it's time for food.
Fans often comment on George's descriptions of food. We have to say they're often glorious. This feast is no exception, and it's worth reading the full passage, if for no other reason than to make our mouths water. It says, "There were great joints of aurochs roasted with leeks, venison pies chunky with carrots, bacon, and mushrooms, mutton chops sauced in honey and cloves, savoury duck, peppered boar, goose, skewers of pigeon and capon, beef and barley stew, cold fruit soup. Lord Wyman had brought 20 casks of fish from White Harbour, packed in salt and seaweed, whitefish and winkles, crabs and mussels, clams, herring, cod, salmon, lobster and lampreys. There was black bread and honey cakes and oaten biscuits. There were turnips and peas and beets, beans and squash and huge red onions. There were baked apples and berry tarts, and pears poached in strong wine. Wheels of white cheese were set at every table, above and below the salt, and flagons of hot spice wine and chilled autumn ale were passed up and down the tables."
Now that we're all good and hungry, how about some entertainment? Lord Manderley, who had provided much of the seafood at the feast, had also provided the musicians in much the same way he would provide food and entertainment many months later for the wedding of Ramsay Snow to the supposed Arya Stark. These singers played songs that Bran approved of. Iron Lances, a song which is also played by Abel the Bard at Winterfell months later, by Daron of the Night's Watch aboard Blackbird, and by the Frey musicians at the Red Wedding. The burning of the ships, which is only heard in this context and could be about either Stark ancestor Brandon the Burner or Nymeria of the Rhoynar, both of whom famously burned their own fleet, and The Bear and the Maiden Fair, which is clearly a favorite of many and is played in just about every situation that music is mentioned.
As was customary, each new dish that came to the hall was presented first to Bran in the Lord's seat. Once he had his fill, Luwin had told him he was expected to send a portion of each to one of the lords on the dais in a gesture of friendship and favour. And so Bran complied, sending salmon to poor sad Lady Hornwood, boar to the boisterous Umbers, and a dish of goose in berries to his friend Clay Kerwin, after which he seemed to have taken the gesture of favour part to heart and sent gifts of food to several people who were neither lords nor guests, including a huge lobster to Joseph the Master of Horse, who had trained Dancer, and sweets to Hodor and Old Nan for no reason but he loved them. When Sir Roderick prompted him to remember his foster brothers of House Frey, he did, sending boiled beets to Little Walder and buttered turnips to Big Walder. At least Big Walder got butter.
With the music in the background and a tide of talk and laughter filling the hall, as well as the usual sounds of plates and cups and dogs squabbling for scraps, it's a scene of joy and normalcy amidst chaos and tragedy. Bran takes advantage of the moment to observe the scene in the hall. Though he sees many familiar faces, it says, they all seemed equally foreign, and once again he's established as more watcher than participant. It says, he watched them as from a distance, as if he still sat in the window of his bedchamber, looking down on the yard below, seeing everything, yet part of nothing.
As Bran watches the guests at their tables, he becomes overwhelmed with the heat and has what he thinks of as a vivid waking dream. In reality, he briefly slipped into Summer's skin, likely aided by the unreal, almost trance-like feeling he had experienced as he observed the feasters. Suddenly, he was elsewhere and experiencing a very different reality. It is cool in the godswood now, steam is rising off the hot pools, and the red leaves of the weirwood are rustling. The smells are richer than here, and before long the moon will rise and my brother will sing to it.
After a moment, Sir Roderick interrupts him, dragging him back to reality by inquiring after his plate and telling him he's done very well both here and at the audiences. As usual, when Roderick or Lewin tell him that he'll be a fine lord one day, Bran's thoughts stubbornly return to his dream of being a knight, which is truly still the only thing he ever wants to be. When he picks up his father's silver goblet for something to steady himself, he falls into a vivid memory of the welcoming feast for Robert, the last time he had seen his father use the cup.
He remembers everyone who had been on the dais and most of the others besides. But this memory isn't especially happy since it ends with sadness. And now they are all gone. It was as if some cruel god had reached down with a great hand and swept them all away. The girls to captivity, John to the wall, Rob and mother to war, King Robert and father to their graves, and perhaps Uncle Benjamin as well. Even down on the benches, there were new men at the tables. Jory was dead, and Fat Tom, and Porther, Allen, Desmond, Hullen, who had been master of horse, Harwin, his son, all those who had gone south with his father, even Septim Ordain and Vaon Poole.
As he sat, wondering who will be gone by the time of the next feast, the door to the hall opened and two final guests arrived. They are led into the hall and introduced by Alebelly, one of the guards who had stayed when Lord Eddard left. It says, "The Lady Mira of House Reed," the rotund guardsman bellowed over the clamor, "with her brother, Jojen of Greywater Watch."
While the Freys mutter insults about frog-eaters and mudmen, Sir Roderick welcomes the two to the feast, and Lewin comes to counsel Bran, telling him, "You must greet these ones warmly. I had not thought to see them here, but you know who they are?" When Bran says yes, he knows them to be the Crannogmen from the Neck. Roderick adds, "Howland Reed was a great friend to your father. These two are his, it would seem."
Bran observed the girl to be near to Rob's age and clad in what was likely traditional garb for her people, though it seemed somewhat out of place here at Winterfell. Her younger brother, closer to Arya's age, was clad all in green and had dark green eyes as well. Together the pair approach Bran, and, kneeling before him, the girl addresses him. "My lords of Stark, the years have passed in their hundreds and their thousands since my folk first swore their fealty to the king in the north. My lord father has sent us here to say the words again for all our people."
Bran was somewhat startled to be the recipient of this speech, since the fealty was owed to Robb himself, but graciously replied that she could speak the words to him in Robb's absence. And so they did. Here's the passage. "To Winterfell we pledge the faith of Greywater," they said together. "Hearth and heart and harvest we yield up to you, my lord. Our swords and spears and arrows are yours to command. Grant mercy to our weak, help to our helpless, and justice to all, and we shall never fail you." "I swear it by earth and water," said the boy in green. "I swear it by bronze and iron," his sister said. "We swear it by ice and fire," they finished together.
So this sounds like an ancient pledge of fealty, grounded in the natural elements, dating back to the days of the first men and the time of the king in the north defeating the last Marsh King. It's also the first time the phrase ice and fire appears in the series, which is followed shortly in A Clash of Kings by Daenerys hearing Rhaegar say, "He is the prince that was promised, and his is the song of ice and fire," during her vision in the House of the Undying. The phrase is only repeated more or less in reference to these two scenes after that, and so the reader is left pondering the mystery of its significance.
But we aren't alone, as Bran struggles to recall everything he'd been taught about the Crannogmen. He thinks, was he supposed to swear something back to them? Their oath was not one he had been taught. Bran formally welcomes the pair and offers them the hospitality of Winterfell, all while wondering what sort of people these were. As they take seats at the high table, Jojen asks bluntly where the direwolves are, with his sister adding, "My brother would like to see them."
Bran was both curious about the reeds and pleased that they wanted to meet the wolves, though he stresses that they would be safe with the wolves if he was there. He was aware that their father was a companion of his own father during Robert's rebellion, and that the two men had exchanged letters over the years, but neither Howland Reed nor any of his people had ever come to Winterfell, as far as Bran knew. Because the noise in the hall prevented him from conversing once the Reeds had taken their seats, Bran had to be content with observing them and asking Sir Roderick questions.
And then the feast was over, and tables were cleared for dancing. Bran observes more wild joy as dancers take to the floor and, quote, "The music grew louder." One of the songs mentioned in this part of the chapter is "The Night That Ended," and Bran describes Hotha Umber blowing a war horn at the part where, quote, "The Night's Watch rode forth to meet the others in the battle for the dawn." This is significant to the lore of the North and the Long Night for being the first place where it's directly stated that, as far as contemporary Northmen were concerned anyway, that the Night's Watch led the defeat of the others at the end of the first long night.
As the dancing carries on, Bran, who cannot join in, announces that he's tired and has Hodor carry him to his chamber. As he lay in his bed thinking over the evening, it says he suddenly remembered something his father had told him. Bran had been asking about the knights of the Kingsguard, whom Eddard said were once a marvel, a shining lesson to the world. In answer to Bran's query about the best one of all, Eddard chose to answer from his own experience. "The finest knight I ever saw was Sir Arthur Dane, who fought with a blade called Dawn, forged from the heart of a fallen star. They called him the Sword of the Morning, and he would have killed me but for Howland Reed."
Bran remembers also that his father had gone sad and silent and wished that he had asked him to explain. And so Bran fell asleep, for once not dreading the dreams that would come, but, quote, "with his head full of knights in gleaming armor, fighting with swords that shone like starfire." But the dream still came, though this was a wolf dream, not a tree dream or a three-eyed crow dream, which means, as we said earlier, that technically speaking, Bran is skin-changing, just as he had done briefly during the feast.
Bran finds himself inside Summer, in the Godswood, able to hear and smell the sounds of the continuing feast. As Summer, he also heard another sound, the rattle of iron, that meant someone had entered the Godswood. Rushing toward the sound, with Shaggy Dog at his heels, Summer could smell the strangers, who seemed unafraid of him and his brother. When the female spoke, the Bran part of Summer's brain whispered, "Mira," and the reader knows that the Reeds could not wait to see the wolves and had entered the Godswood on their own in spite of Bran's earlier warnings.
As the two humans approached the wolves, still showing no fear in spite of Shaggy's growls, Mira seemed awed by their size. Her brother replies that they will be bigger still before they are grown, and comments that Summer is strong, quote, "stronger than he knows." When Mira cautions her brother, his reply, "He won't hurt me. This is not the day I die," hints at something very unusual about Jojen Reed. But as Jojen reaches out and touches Summer's muzzle, the dream dissolves for Bran and becomes a dream of falling.
It's not yet clear if Jojen was able to sense Bran inside Summer, though he could clearly sense something about both wolves, fear and rage for Shaggy, and great strength for Summer. But the end of the dream marks the end of the chapter. When we next see Bran and the Reeds, it will also be in the Godswood, albeit many weeks later. Up next, Bran learns some uncomfortable things from Jojen Reed about magic and his own nature. And now it's time to give thanks to our patrons from the Valyrian Steel level. Aileen, Oxheart, Amber the Adamant, Blithe Spirit, Archmaester Kobe of the Higher Mysteries, Cabeth the Unfrozen, Dean, Dolorous Fred, Lord Sosa and his faithful canine companion Theoden, Jill, JM, Herbert Westeros the Miskatonic Maester, Lady Silverwing, Mark, Boss, Schwartz the Black, the Sithorian, Sally, Tristis Lorien, Wild Child of the Wolfswood, W, Sword of the Evening, and Lady Direliz of Castleknocky, the Alpha Patron, as well as our Dragonglass patron, Lynn.
So long as there was magic, anything could happen. Ghosts could walk, trees could talk, and broken boys could grow up to be knights. But there isn't, he said aloud in the darkness of his bed. There's no magic, and the stories are just stories.
Bran's fourth chapter of A Clash of Kings opens, as we said, in the Godswood, almost 2 months after the Harvest Feast. The Reeds have extended their stay to become Bran's constant companions. In the first scene, we see Mira and Bran and Summer playing a rambunctious game, which leads to Bran wishing the Reeds were his foster siblings instead of the Walders.
The Reeds are both older than Bran, but seem like a good fit for a boy who is missing his older siblings. Mira reminds Bran of Arya, while Jojen is so serious that old Nan has taken to calling him little grandfather. Bran is fascinated by Mira's net and asks her how she learned to use it. He's surprised to hear that not only does Greywater Watch not have a master at arms, it has no maester, and it moves.
In meta term, this is likely a reference to the well-known fantasy novel Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones, but to Bran, it's simply confusing. Because he doesn't know if Mira is teasing or if he should believe her, he simply replies that he'd like to see it when the war is over. Mira tells him warmly that he'd be welcome anytime, and Jojen adds earnestly, "It would be good if you left Winterfell, Bran."
Bran would really love to go to Greywater, but he knows Luwin wouldn't allow it. Sir Roderick might, he says, but the Castellan has gone east to deal with the problem that ought to have been solved at the Harvest Feast. The very night Lady Hornwood returned to our castle, it appears the bastard of Bolton had seized her and married her by force. When he had carried her off to the Dreadfort, Lord Wyman Manderley had seized Hornwood to protect it, he had written, but Sir Roderick was equally angry about that second, if less serious, act of lawlessness.
And so it appears that the North is suffering from not having a strong lord at Winterfell, Bran's admirable performance at the Harvest Feast notwithstanding. And now Jojen Reed adds to the sense that things might be in a downward spiral by telling Bran he should leave Winterfell sooner rather than later. Mira explains this comment to Bran by telling him, "My brother has the green sight. He dreams things that haven't happened, but sometimes they do."
Jojen insists that there is no sometimes, and it says that a look passed between the siblings, him sad, her defiant, almost as if he has seen a future so bad that Mira desperately wants him to be wrong. Bran catches on and asks Jojen to tell him, but Jojen has a price. "I will," he says, "if you'll tell me about your dreams."
Bran is extremely reluctant to talk about his dreams. In fact, he doesn't want to even admit that he has dreams. Aloud, he says, "I don't have dreams. Maester Luwin gives me sleeping draughts." But he cannot hide from his thoughts, in which he remembers the Golden Man and the Three-Eyed Crow, and something else that is potentially more worrying to a young boy, the crunch of bones between his jaws and the coppery taste of blood.
Jojen sees the fear behind Bran's denials and urges him to tell them what he's so frightened of. When Bran continues to deflect and deny, "I don't want to, it's only dreams," Mira points out that not all dreams are equal. Green dreams, such as the ones her brother has, are a thing apart. And so Jojen goes first and tells Bran about one of his green dreams. "I dreamed of a winged wolf bound to earth with grey stone chains. It was a green dream, so I knew it was true. A crow was trying to peck through the chains, but the stone was too hard, and his beak could only chip at them.
This caught Bran's attention, and he immediately asked if the crow had 3 eyes. When Jojen answered in the affirmative, he also caught Summer's attention. Jojen explained that the crow had first visited his dreams years ago when he was very sick with a childhood illness. This prompted Bran to admit that he knew the crow as well. He came to me after I fell. And, he added, he said I had to fly or die, and I woke up only I was broken, and I couldn't fly after all.
Mira very confidently told him that he could fly if he wanted to, while Jojen explained seriously, "You are the winged wolf, Bran. The crow sent us here to break your chains." This confuses Bran, who wants to know if the crow is at Greywater, which is a reasonable question since that's where the reeds came from, and apparently wanted him to return with them. But no, Jojen tells him the crow is north, to which Mira adds, beyond the wall, and that their father had sent them to Winterfell after he found out about Jojen's dreams.
Howland Reed, if you recall, not only forged a strong bond with Ned Stark in his youth, but also spent a winter with the Green Men on the Isle of Faces. While we've yet to see exactly what goes on there, though George has assured us we will, we can probably assume that there was magic and green seeing involved. Remember that the winter that preceded the so-called false spring when Howland emerged from the Isle is likely to have lasted at least a year, if not longer, and so we can imagine that there was plenty of time for the young Crannogman to learn much and more from these mentors.
The Green Men are an order formed at the time of the pact between the First Men and the Children of the Forest to tend the weirwood trees in the south, particularly those that had been carved with faces in order to witness the agreement on the Isle of Faces. With their deep connection to the children and the mysticism surrounding weirwood trees and those who can see through them, it's very likely that the knowledge Howland sought from them was magical in nature. And Howland, having at least a grounding in the green magics, would explain why he took Jojen's dream so seriously that he sent his children to Winterfell.
Bran wants to know how Jojen would help him break the chains that he saw in his dream, and Jojen makes it seem very simple. Open your eye. When Bran protests that his eyes are open, Jojen reminds him that the crow gave him a third eye, though he had yet to open it. To an obviously confused Bran, he explained, "With 2 eyes, you see my face. With 3, you could see my heart. With 2, you can see that oak tree there. With 3, you could see the acorn the oak grew from and the stump that it will one day become. With 2, you see no farther than your walls. With 3, you would gaze south to the summer sea and north beyond the wall."
Such talk makes Bran nervous, and he tries to change the subject, asking Mira about lizard lions. When she tries to answer, Jojen interrupts and asks Bran if he dreamed of a lizard lion. Bran says no, and unwilling to let the talk stray from the topic of dreams, Jojen asks if he's dreamed of a wolf. Bran is now so uncomfortable that he's beginning to get angry, and Summer is restless. He insists that he doesn't have to tell Jojen anything about his dreams, being the prince, but Jojen persists. Here's the passage. "Was it summer? You be quiet. The night of the harvest feast, you dreamed you were summer in the godswood, didn't you?" "Stop it," Bran shouted. Summer slid toward the weirwood, his white teeth bared. Jojen Reed took no mind. "When I touched Summer, I felt you in him, just as you're in him now." "You couldn't have. I was in bed. I was sleeping." "You are in the godswood, all in grey." "It was only a bad dream." Jojen stood. "I felt you. I felt you fall. Is that what scares you, the falling?"
Internally, Bran thinks that yes, he is afraid of the falling and the Golden Man, who he doesn't know to be the Queen's brother. Bran is haunted by the memory of his fall from that tower and doesn't know how to tell anyone what he's experiencing. In fact, he thinks that perhaps if he doesn't talk about it, He'll eventually forget, which is all he wants to do. But Jojen wants him to remember, asking, "Do you fall every night, Bran?"
That question prompts a growl from Summer, and a nervous Mira asks Bran to keep him back. Bran tries to dissemble, claiming that Jojen is doing it, making Summer angry. Jojen persists, naming the anger as Bran's and insisting, "Part of you is Summer, and part of Summer is you. You know that, Bran." Bran continues to deny everything Jojen says, but inwardly knows that he had not only howled with the wolves in the night, but also tasted blood with them. But the confusion of his emotions, clearly very strong, leads Summer to lunge at the reeds.
Things happen very quickly then. Mira asking Bran to call Summer off, Bran realizing he'd lost control of the wolf, and Shaggy Dog racing out of the undergrowth to join his brother. At Mira's frantic command, both she and Jojen scrambled up a tree, with Jojen insisting, as he had done that first night, "Today is not the day I die." Only after a very near miss did Bran remember that Hodor was nearby and call for help, telling his friends they won't hurt Hodor, while also feeling quite frightened and not a little bit ashamed.
Hodor was successful in running off the wolves, and the reeds were able to descend, with Jojen telling Bran, "We will talk again," as they took their leave. A shaken Bran, unable to understand what had happened, asked Hodor to take him to see Maester Luwin. Once there, Bran lost no time in coming to the point, telling Luwin, "Mira says her brother has the green sight."
Having gained the maester's attention, Bran continued, "You told me that the children of the forest had the green sight." Luwin agrees that some did claim that power and were called green seers. Bran wants to know if green sight is magic, and Luwin explains that it seems to be a different sort of knowledge, one that no living man now understands since the children have gone from the world. He elaborates that the first men believed that the green seers could see through the eyes of the weirwoods, and also that they had some sort of power over animals, and asks if Jojen Reed has claimed such talents.
Bran states that he thinks it's just a matter of dreams that come true, which Luwin finds easy to dismiss. He even has a rational explanation for why Bran and Rickon simultaneously dreamed of their father's death, and then tells Bran a story about his maester's chain. Each link of the chain symbolizes a branch of learning: black iron for ravenry, silver for healing, etc. And Luwin is one of the few, about 1%, of maesters who possesses a link of Valyrian steel, which represents the higher mysteries, or magic, as Bran might term it.
He goes on to tell Bran about his studies. Fascinating, he says, but of small use. He admits that in the course of his studies he had tried to uncover hidden powers through the use of spells, but had failed. Sad to say, magic does not work, he concludes, and in the face of Bran's continued protests, he speaks about the transient nature of life, and even of the natural world, adding, "Perhaps magic was once a mighty force in the world, but no longer. What little remains is no more than a wisp of smoke that lingers in the air after a great fire has burned out, and even that is fading. Valyria was the last ember, and Valyria is gone. The dragons are no more, the giants are dead, the children of the forest forgotten with all their lore. No, my prince, Jojen Reed may have had a dream or two that he believes came true, but he does not have the green sight. No living man has that power."
Putting aside the fact that here we're introduced to the fact that the study of magic is still alive and well at the Citadel, and that Luwin himself had engaged in it, it might be instructive to review the list of things Luwin claims are lost. Dragons, giants, children of the forest, even Valyria. The reader knows, or will soon know, that the only thing on his list that is truly gone is Valyria, but that many of Valyria's children remain. If Luwin is wrong about that, he may well be wrong about green seeing, as Mira suggested to Bran later in the evening when she came to visit him in his chamber.
Bran began with an apology, but added that Jojen shouldn't have spoken about his dreams, declaring that the crow, whose presence in his dreams Bran has apparently accepted, is not only real, but something he shares with Jojen, had lied, and so had her brother. When Mira suggests Luwin was wrong, Bran clings to the infallibility of adults, which so many young children believe in. Changing tack, Mira asks if she can tell Bran about a dream her brother had about Bran and the Walders. You were sitting at supper, but instead of a servant, Maester Luwin brought you your food. He served you the king's cut off the roast, the meat rare and bloody, but with a savory smell that made everyone's mouth water. The meat he served to the Freys was old and gray and dead, yet they liked their supper better than you liked yours.
Though Bran doesn't understand her, she says that he will, and that they will talk again when he does. Disturbed by her words, Bran was relieved that everyone was served the same pigeon pie at table that night, and nothing out of the ordinary occurred. But it says he was also a little disappointed because magic, at its heart, was possibility. So long as there was magic, anything could happen. Ghosts could walk, trees could talk, and broken boys could grow up to be knights.
Bran, just 9 years old, is struggling to understand not only the nature of what he thinks of as magic, but also his own nature and the reasons why his life has unraveled to the point where not only has his family been taken away, but all of his early dreams as well. After months of being told by some that he must accept that his dreams of knighthood are dead, and simultaneously by the three-eyed crow in his dreams that he could fly, Bran is ready to reject magic fully on account of it giving him false hope.
The chapter ends with Bran in his bed, stubbornly thinking that there is no magic and rejecting its false promises. He would never walk, nor fly, nor be a knight. Of course, being 9 years old, Bran still has a thing or two to learn about absolutes, about hope, and about possibility. But what happens in his next chapter will completely reverse his feelings about the things Jojen Reed wants to tell him. Up next, we'll learn about the green dreams that brought the Reeds to Winterfell. I dreamed of the man who came today, the one they call Reek. You and your brother lay dead at his feet, and he was skinning off your faces with a long red blade.
Bran's 5th chapter opens with Bran assisting Mikken in the forge when he's called to Maester Luwin's tower to hear some recently arrived news from Robb. Luwin assembles not only Bran and Rickon, but the Walders as well, indicating that the news also affects them. It seems that Robb has won a great victory in the Westerlands at a place called Oxcross, but that in the process, Sir Stevron Frey has been killed.
We've discussed the battle at Oxcross before, most notably in our coverage of Robb and the War of the Five Kings. It was an important victory for Robb deep inside Lannister territory, which resulted in the death of the Lannister commander, Sir Stafford, brother-in-law and cousin to Lord Tywin. Also among the casualties were Sir Stevron Frey, Lord Walder's eldest son and heir, which explains why the Walders were summoned to hear the news.
It says that Bran was, quote, glad for Robb's victory, but disquieted as well, and he recalls Osha's words on the day Robb left Winterfell. He's marching the wrong way. For reasons Bran cannot yet name, he's extremely uneasy about Robb being ever further from Winterfell, almost as though he can sense a threat that might arrive while his brother is occupied in the south.
The Walders, however, show no signs of distress and immediately fall to bickering about the complicated Frey succession. With Stevron dead, the heir is now his son Ryman, but perhaps more importantly, for anyone descended from Lord Walder's younger sons, as the two Walders at Winterfell are, everyone in the line of succession moves up a spot. Luwin is shocked by their callous attitude, but the two boys brush it off while claiming a very insincere grief.
Bran realizes that this is Jojen's dream about being served a meal by Lewin coming true. Bran received good news, or the king's cut, while the Walders received what was ostensibly bad news, the old and gray and dead meat from the dream, and yet Bran feels anxious, while the Walders seem unaffected and possibly even happy. Thinking, they like the taste of this dish better than I do, Bran makes the connection explicit and asks to be excused.
He's returned to his chamber by Osha, whom he peppers with questions about life beyond the wall. He wants to know if giants, children of the forest, and the others really exist, and if she's ever seen a three-eyed crow. While the wildling woman can confirm that giants still live and that she's heard tell of the children, she wants to know why he's asking about the White Walkers, using the term that the free folk seem to apply to what those south of the wall call the others. Bran avoids answering, and she leaves him in his window seat to await the arrival of the Reeds.
Both Mira and Jojen arrive moments later, and they seem to know what's happened. Bran tries to explain about the news and his reaction and his confusion about the feast from the dream being news rather than actual food, and Jojen tells him that the green dreams take strange shapes sometimes, and admits that it's often difficult to interpret them. Nevertheless, Bran is now ready to hear about Jojen's other dream, the dream that had brought the Reeds to Winterfell in the first place, and which Jojen had implied warned of an impending danger.
And so Jojen tells him that it's the sea that comes, and then elaborates. I dreamed that the sea was lapping all around Winterfell. I saw black waves crashing against the gates and towers, and then the salt water came flowing over the walls and filled the castle. Drowned men were floating in the yard. When I first dreamed the dream back at Greywater, I didn't know their faces, but now I do. That ale belly is one, the guard who called our names at the feast. Your Septon's another, your Smith as well.
Bran is disbelieving and, forgetting the lesson of the feast dream, tells Jojen that the sea is hundreds of miles away and it isn't possible. Jojen insists, in the dark of night, the salt sea will flow over these walls. I saw the dead, bloated and drowned. And Mira gently tells him that warning Chael and Mikken and Alebelly will change nothing, since they'll not believe the warning.
Then Jojen asks Bran once again to tell him about his own dreams. This time Bran, though frightened and reluctant, tells his friends about the different types of dreams he has. There's the wolf dreams. Those aren't so bad as the others. I run and hunt and kill squirrels. And there's dreams where the crow comes and tells me to fly. Sometimes the tree is in those dreams too, calling my name. That frightens me. But the worst dreams are when I fall. I never used to fall before. When I climbed, I went every place, up on the roofs and along the walls. I used to feed the crows in the burned tower. Mother was afraid that I would fall, but I knew I never would. Only I did, and now when I sleep, I fall all the time.
Bran doesn't mention the Queen's brother, who also appears in his dreams, probably more often than he'd like to admit. He hasn't yet understood why Jaime is there, or remembered the things he saw just before his fall. He seems to know instinctively that there's something wrong with the fact that he fell, but he isn't quite ready to remember what really happened.
Bran essentially describes three types of dream: wolf dreams, visitations by an unknown entity, the so-called three-eyed crow, and nightmares. The wolf dreams, where he runs and experiences life through summer, sound almost pleasant, while the visitations by the three-eyed crow seem non-threatening but confusing. Bran doesn't understand what's being asked of him. The recurring nightmare of falling is clearly Bran's brain continually resurfacing the trauma of his accident, trying to show him the truth of what happened. Interestingly, through Bran's POV, we see the crow interrupting or obscuring the knowledge that might be gained through these dreams as unimportant, at least in the moment.
Jojen listens to Bran and then speaks a single word: warg. To Bran's startled question, Jojen adds, warg, Shape changer, beastling, that is what they will call you if they should ever hear of your wolf dreams. It's part explanation, part warning, which causes no small amount of anxiety for Bran. As Jojen explains how his own people will fear him and even hate him, Bran thinks of old Nan's stories about beastlings and shape changers who, in the stories, were always evil. He denies what Jojen is telling him, saying defensively, "It's only dreams."
Jojen goes on to elaborate about the wolf dreams. They are, he says, not dreams at all, but the result of his third eye opening as he relaxes into sleep, thus allowing his soul to seek out its other half. He adds cryptically, "The power is strong in you," but Bran wants nothing to do with wargs or third eyes or any sort of power, repeating his broken childhood dream that he's continually using as a shield against his new reality. "I want to be a knight."
The crux of Bran's dreaming seems to be the opening of his third eye. It's what the crow continually asks him to do. It's what leads, albeit unconsciously, to his wolf dreams, and what Jojen seems to think would put an end to his falling nightmares. He tells Bran, "A knight is what you want. A warg is what you are. You can't change that, Bran. You can't deny it or push it away. You are the winged wolf, but you will never fly unless you open your eye."
Bran is still unsure how he's supposed to open this mysterious eye, and Jojen tells him he must search with his heart. When asked if he's afraid, Bran replies somewhat defiantly that Maester Luwin told him that there's nothing to fear from dreams. But there is, Jojen insists, adding the specifics as the past, the future, the truth.
Obviously, in Bran's case, there's a truth in his past that is very frightening. As for the future, we're left to ponder that when the Reeds leave. And Bran's next move is an attempt to warn Chael, Mikken, and Alebelly. Mikken seems delighted about an opportunity to see the sea, while Chael is simultaneously unconcerned about dying or drowning, telling Bran that he places his fate in the hands of the gods, and adding that he is a very good swimmer, so has no fear of water. Alebelly is another matter.
Yeah, the guardsman took the warning to heart and even went to talk to Jojen, who apparently confirmed what Bran had said. For days afterwards, Alebelly refused to bathe until he smelled so bad that some of his fellow guardsmen, quote, threw him into a tub of scalding water and scrubbed him raw. It was just a few days later that Sir Roderick returned from his mission to the Hornwood and the Dreadfort with a prisoner who smelled, quote, worse than Alebelly had.
And so Reek enters the Winterfell orbit, and Bran's story inches one step closer to seeing the fulfillment of Jojen's warnings. Sir Roderick explains the situation in the Hornwood to Maester Luwin over supper. Poor Lady Hornwood was forcibly married to the bastard of the Dreadfort, then locked up in a tower and left to starve to death as soon as she had been coerced into signing a will in Ramsay's favor. We get a hint as to what that coercion was through a part of the story that Roderick no doubt did not repeat at table himself. It says, Bran had heard men saying that when Sir Roderick had smashed down the door, he found her with her mouth all bloody and her fingers chewed off.
And the clue for readers comes 3 books later, in Theon's first chapter since the end of A Clash of Kings. Theon is being held at the Dreadfort by Ramsay Snow, very much not dead, as Sir Roderick tells Bran and Luwin in Bran 5, and is now known to his captors as Reek. Here's the relevant passage. "There's blood on your mouth," Ramsay observed. "Have you been chewing your fingers again, Reek?" "No, no, my lord, I swear." Reek had tried to bite his own ring finger off once to stop it hurting after they had stripped the skin from it. Lord Ramsay would never simply cut off a man's finger. He preferred to flay it and let the exposed flesh dry and crack and fester. Reek had been whipped and racked and cut, but there was no pain half so excruciating as the pain that followed flaying. It was the sort of pain that drove men mad, and it could not be endured for long. Soon or late the victim would scream, "Please, no more, no more, stop it hurting, cut it off." and Lord Ramsay would oblige. It was a game they played. Reek had learned the rules, as his hands and feet could testify, but that one time he had forgotten and tried to end the pain himself with his teeth. Ramsay had not been pleased, and the offence had cost Reek another toe.
And so we see shades of Lady Hornwood's story in this one, and we can, in hindsight, guess that the poor lady had her fingers flayed to induce her to comply with Ramsay's wishes, and then chewed them off herself, not out of hunger, though she may certainly have been hungry, but out of excruciating pain. The poor woman had died in agony and madness, and the outcome was that since she left behind a will naming Ramsay Snow as her heir, in spite of his apparent death, Sir Roderick feared that Roose Bolton would want to seize those lands for himself one day, in spite of the claim that Lord Wyman Manderley now made.
To help him make his case against that, he had captured this man known as Reek, who he said had been Ramsay's servant. Roderick spoke of the need to keep the man alive for Robb to interview, and also his own frustration that he lacked the strength to stop the fighting between Manderleys and Boltons that was happening on the Hornwood lands.
Mention of the foul-smelling serving man Reek brings Sir Roderick to another subject. He asks Bran sternly what has led him to frighten guardsmen into not washing. Bran's response: "The sea is coming here. Jojen saw it in a green dream. Alebelly is going to drown," leads to Luwin explaining Jojen Reed's dreams to Sir Roderick. And then he makes an explicit connection between Jojen's warnings about the sea to something that's happening to the west of Winterfell along the stony shore.
Luwin reveals that there's trouble along the coast of the Sunset Sea. He mentions raiders in longships plundering fishing villages, raping and burning, and adds that Leopold Toolheart has sent his nephew Benfred, last heard of being ordered by Sir Roderick himself to remain at Torrens Square to deal with them. Luwin concludes that the raiders will likely flee at the first sight of armed men.
Sir Roderick is clearly frustrated, saying that the Ironborn would likely continue to raid in other areas along the coast until a concerted effort was made to stop them. He then voices something that was likely part of the anxiety Bran had felt over the news from Oxcross. "They would never dare, no more than the Bastard of Bolton, if our main strength were not 1,000 leagues south."
So Robb is too far away to tend to his own kingdom, and he's left it too lightly guarded, trusting far too much in the loyalty of his own men, in Theon Greyjoy's influence over the Ironborn, and in the Night's Watch to protect his lands and borders. Roderick clearly understands this, and so does Bran on some level. And the Castellan doesn't dismiss Jojen's warnings out of hand either. Instead he asks what else he had said, and so Bran tells him. He said the water would flow over our walls. He saw Alebelly drowned, and Mikken and Septon Chael too.
Focusing on the things in the equation that he had control of, Roderick wanted to know if Jojen had seen him dead. When Bran says no, Sir Roderick found some logic to console them. "Should it happen that I need to ride against these raiders myself, I shan't take Alebelly then." This gave Bran some hope that perhaps just avoiding the sea might be enough, though of course both man and boy seem to have ignored the part of the dream in which the sea flowed over the walls of Winterfell.
Still, Bran was feeling much better when he saw Meera and Jojen later that evening. While Meera at first seemed to agree with him, Jojen reminds him that his green dreams cannot be changed. An angry Meera wanted to know what the point of such dreams were if their warnings cannot be used to change outcomes. Jojen wasn't sure, but was still convinced, while Meera said that Alebelly should fight, adding that so should Bran.
That last part alarmed Bran, who instantly caught on to the implication of her words. Meera appeared guilty and started to say that she ought not to have said anything, but Bran was already asking Jojen, "Did you see me in a green dream? Was I drowned?" And Jojen's answer revealed another layer of accuracy to his prophetic dreaming. "Not drowned," Jojen spoke as if every word pained him. I dreamed of the man who came today, the one they call Reek. You and your brother lay dead at his feet, and he was skinning off your faces with a long red blade.
A clearly upset Mira declares that she would go to the dungeons and kill Reek, for how could he kill Bran if he was dead? Jojen doesn't have the answers and can only repeat what he saw, adding to Bran that he had also seen the ending. I saw you and Rickon in your crypts, down in the dark, with all the dead kings and their stone wolves.
Now Bran understands why Jojen had asked him to go away with them sooner rather than later. It seems like these dreams about Reek and the crypts must have come in the time since their original conversation about the dream that had first led the Reeds to Winterfell. When Bran says that he will go away now, either to Greywater Watch or even in search of the Crow, Jojen sadly tells him that it won't matter. The dream was green, he says, and green dreams do not lie.
And so, according to Jojen, there's no avoiding the fate that's making its way towards them as inexorably as a rising tide. And as we'll see in the final sections of this analysis, Jojen's green dreams are indeed accurate, though the things that happen are not in fact what they seem. But one thing about them was very true. There is peril coming for Bran and the occupants of Winterfell. Up next, we'll see what happens when the sea at last comes to Winterfell.
His brother came sliding through the trees, moving almost as quiet as another brother he remembered dimly from long ago, the white one with the eyes of blood. This brother's eyes were pools of shadow, but the fur on the back of his neck was bristling. He had heard the sounds as well, and known they meant danger. This time the clink and scrape were followed by a slithering and the soft, swift patter of skin feet on stone. The wind brought the faintest whiff of a man smell he did not know. Stranger, danger, death.
Bran's sixth chapter of A Clash of Kings begins from Summer's point of view. It's night and the sleeping Bran is sharing his wolf's consciousness. The first quarter or so of the chapter deals with Summer's awareness of out-of-place sounds coming from beyond the iron gates that trap him and his brother inside the Godswood. It becomes clear that the sounds he's hearing and the scents he smells are the sounds and smells of strangers entering Winterfell, accompanied by muffled shouts and the furious barking of dogs from the kennels.
When Summer tries, using Bran's knowledge, to climb a tree and thus escape his stone-walled prison, he ultimately fails, falling to the ground and causing the sleeping boy to awake in his chamber. Bran instantly knows that something is very wrong and thinks about Jojen's green dream that had brought him and his sister north. The sea has come. It's flowing over the walls, just as Jojen saw. He calls for help until he realizes there's none to be had. Sir Roderick had departed a week ago, taking all the men of fighting age to fight Ironborn under the command of Dagmar Cleftjaw at Torrhen Square.
Sir Roderick had raised 600 men, leaving a mere token garrison to guard Winterfell, riding to help the beleaguered Tallhearts, and summoning their nearest neighbour Clay Kerwin with 300 men from Castle Kerwin, along with men from White Harbour, the Wolfswood and the Barrowlands, to meet him along his march. Not once did Sir Roderick or Maester Luwin, now in nominal charge of Winterfell, along with 9-year-old Bran, contemplate the possibility of an enemy coming from the dark to take Winterfell with fewer than 50 men.
Bran's cries eventually bring a stranger to his chamber, an armed man who Bran angrily tells to go away. That man, though, is followed by Theon Greyjoy, which gives Bran a momentary sense of relief. Knowing that Theon had left Winterfell 8 months previously as Robb's foster brother and trusted lieutenant, Bran eagerly asks if Robb had sent him and if Robb was there now. Theon's reply, "Robb's far away. He can't help you now," leaves Bran confused until Theon tells him that he, like Bran, is now a prince and that he'd taken Winterfell, saying, "I sent 4 men over the walls with grappling claws and ropes, and they opened a postern gate for the rest of us."
Those were the sounds Summer had heard in the Godswood. But when Bran begins to argue with Theon, he's sternly told to dress and be ready to address the small folk of the castle. Theon wants him to formally surrender Winterfell and tell its people to obey Theon for their own good. Maester Luwin arrives with a gash to the head, likely obtained when he was caught sending ravens from his rookery. He tells Bran that one was brought down by Theon's archers, but that another, the White Harbour bird, had gotten away. He also tells him how Theon's men had penetrated the walls of the great fortress. They swam the moat, climbed the walls with hook and rope, came over wet and dripping, steel in hand.
And so we learn that this is indeed Jojen's dream coming true. The sea has come to Winterfell, and the first casualty was Alebelly, who had been guarding the gate when they arrived. After Luwin dresses Bran in his finery, one of Theon's men arrives to take them down to the Great Hall. Along the way, Rickon, Jojen, Meera, and the Walders are herded into their wake, and the small group of hostages enters the hall to see Theon seated in the high seat, prompting 4-year-old Rickon to state, "Theon's sitting in Robb's chair."
Though only 9 years old, Bran has a much better grasp on the reality of their situation than 4-year-old Rickon, and so he hushes his brother before being dumped on the seat, now vacated by Theon, by the man their erstwhile foster brother calls Lauren. As Bran looks around the hall, he observes a wounded guardsman, Hayhead, a handful of other guards, a bewildered old Nan accompanied by her great-grandson Hodor, and a terrified Beth Cassell.
Moments later, another group enters. Asha and Gage from the kitchens, Mikken from his forge, and Farlan and Palla from the kennels. Palla is clutching her torn dress and weeping, and Septon Chael tries to help her, but is knocked over by one of the Iron Men. Bran is far too young to understand the implications of what he sees, as he was too young to understand the stories he heard about Ramsay Snow in the last chapter after Sir Roderick returned with Reek. And speaking of Reek, the stinking prisoner is the last to be marched into the hall.
Theon is half amused and half disgusted by Reek and questions who he is. Reek lays claim to the name of Heek and says he had served the bastard of the Dreadfort before his master was killed by the Starks. Their exchange is interrupted by one of the men closing the massive doors, which causes Bran to realize that there are no more than 20 Ironborn in the room, with likely only another 10 or so left outside as guards. This attack would have never succeeded if Sir Roderick hadn't left so few men to guard the castle, which will turn out is exactly what Theon had planned.
As Theon tries to address the household, an angry Mikken heckles him with threats and insults. Although Bran pleads with him to be silent and, hoping to keep his people safe, says the words that Theon demands of him. "I have yielded Winterfell to Prince Theon. All of you shall do as he commands you." Mikken continues to shout angrily when Theon declares that his father, Balon Greyjoy, has claimed the North by right of conquest and that henceforth they will all serve him. Mikken cannot help but declare his loyalties loudly. "Bugger that! I serve the Starks, not some treasonous squid!"
Mikken is thrown face first to the floor and slowly raises himself to his hands and knees as Theon continues to speak about being a good lord and expecting loyal service. As Bran looks on in horror, silently wishing Mikken to hold his tongue, the man shouts, "If you think you can hold the North with this sorry lotter..." He never finishes his sentence as a bald spearman called Stig, one of Theon's crewmen, steps forward and drives a spear through his neck. Amidst the commotion, as Bran numbly watches Mikken die, he thinks, it's blood he drowned on, his own blood.
And the fact that Mikken marks the second death of the 3 that Jojen had predicted isn't lost on Bran, who is powerless to intervene as 2 other spearmen beat a distraught Hodor into silence. And as Theon continues to exhort the inhabitants of the castle to serve him with a mixture of threats and promises, 2 of his audience stand forth. The first is the man known as Reek, who declares that Theon will need more men if he wants to hold the castle against the Northmen, who will inevitably arrive to take it back. Theon allows that he might be able to use him, but for the stench, to which Reek promptly offers to wash in exchange for his freedom.
When Theon agrees, the man known as Reek probably can't believe his luck, going from prisoner to free man for the cost of a bath. As Reek bends his knee and swears an oath of loyalty to House Greyjoy and King Balon, Bran realizes that even more of the Green Dream was coming true. The next defection comes as a shock to Bran. Osha stands and declares that she's done being a kitchen wench and asks for a spear. It's Stig who provides it, though as someone who knew Asha Greyjoy, perhaps he ought to have known better than to insult a warrior woman. Here's the passage. "I got a spear for you right here," said the bald man who'd killed Mikken. He grabbed his crotch, grinning. Osha drove her bony knee up between his legs. "You keep that soft pink thing." She wrested the spear from him and used the butt to knock him off his feet. "I'll have me the wood and iron." The bald man writhed on the floor while the other reavers sent up gales of laughter.
Asha was the last of the group to swear service to Theon, and so the servants were warned to do their work and make no trouble before being dismissed. As the chapter ends, Bran is returned to his chamber by a weeping Hodor. We'll hear no more from Bran directly until the final chapter of A Clash of Kings, which will take place about 2 months later. To fill in the gaps, up next, we'll check in with Theon Greyjoy himself as the remainder of the Winterfell arc in A Clash of Kings plays out over the course of his final 2 point-of-view chapters.
The sky was a gloom of cloud, the woods dead and frozen. Roots grabbed at Theon's feet as he ran, and bare branches lashed his face, leaving thin stripes of blood across his cheeks. He crashed through heedless, breathless, icicles flying to pieces before him. "Mercy," he sobbed. From behind came a shuddering howl that curdled his blood. "Mercy, mercy." When he glanced back over his shoulder, he saw them coming, great wolves the size of horses with the heads of small children. "Oh, mercy, mercy." Blood dripped from their mouths, black as pitch, burning holes in the snow where it fell. Every stride brought them closer. Theon tried to run faster, but his legs would not obey. The trees all had faces, and they were laughing at him, laughing, and the howl came again. He could smell the hot breath of the beasts behind him, a stink of brimstone and corruption. "They're dead, dead! I saw them killed!" he tried to shout. "I saw their heads dipped in tar!" But when he opened his mouth, only a moan emerged. And then something touched him, and he whirled, shouting.
The next chapter set at Winterfell is Theon 4, taking place about 2 weeks after the fall of the castle. Theon had arrived in the north around 6 weeks previously, taking part in the raiding along the stony shore that Luwin and Sir Roderick had discussed in Bran 5. There he had defeated and killed Benfred Tallheart, sent from Torrhen Square to deal with the raiders. Tallheart died, telling him, "Robb will gut you, Greyjoy," which stung, but by then Theon had devised what he thought was a cunning plan in defiance of his father's wishes.
Balon had ordered Theon to raid the shore with his uncle Aeron and the fearsome warrior Dagmar Cleftjaw. His sister Asha and uncle Victarion were given much larger fleets and tasked with seizing Deepwood Motte and Moat Cailin respectively. To say that Theon's plan to seize and hold Winterfell with 30 men was a response to the much larger role in the Ironborn invasion of the north that had been assigned to his sister barely scratches the surface of the sibling rivalry that Theon feels in the aftermath of rejoining his birth family. But we aren't going to dig into that relationship here. We have a whole episode, number 18, covering Theon, and just now we're going to keep our focus tightly on where he intersects with Bran and Winterfell.
Following Theon taking Winterfell in Bran 6, as mentioned, about 2 weeks passed before Theon 4, During that time, he sent one of his men to his sister at Deepwood Motte, requesting reinforcements to help him hold the castle. Stig has yet to return on the night when Theon is awoken by something, possibly some small sound or perhaps an instinct for trouble. Once fully awake, he listens carefully and tries to convince himself that the silence he hears means all is peaceful in his new fiefdom, until he realizes that something is missing.
Yeah, apparently in the days since his nighttime attack, the wolves, still penned in the godswood, had been howling at all hours of the day and night. It says he had grown so used to the howling of the direwolves that he scarcely heard it any more. But on this night, some part of his brain had become aware of its absence, and so, in sudden panic, he calls for a guard and sends him to investigate the wolfswood. Then he sends his squire, young Wex Pike, to check on Bran and Rickon.
Within minutes, Wex returns shaking his head, and the guard follows with a negative. Bran and Rickon and both wolves are gone. It's a furious Theon Greyjoy who orders the Winterfell people roused from their beds and his men Erzin and Black Lauren to make a check of all the gates. But before Theon can confront the sobbing servants, Erzin returns, telling Theon to come to the Hunter's Gate.
At the gate, Theon finds the evidence of a carefully planned escape. Both guards who had been on duty are dead, one apparently killed by a woman who had lured him into the gatehouse with the promise of sex, and the other by the two direwolves. The woman would prove to be Osha, and along with Bran and Rickon, it was discovered that Hodor and the Reeds were also missing. After ascertaining that no horses were missing, and therefore the group would be on foot, Theon begins planning a hunt to take place at dawn.
Accompanying him on his hunt will be several of Winterfell's own, including Joseth, the Master of Horse, Farland, the Kennel Master, and Maester Luwin, whom Theon doesn't trust to leave behind in his tower. He also selects a trio of his own men and his squire Wex to guard his back, as well as the serving man known as Reek, who carries a mysterious sack as they set out in the dawn.
The party, at least Theon's men, have armed themselves with weapons meant to protect them from being savaged by the wolves, long spears and axes with a reach that might offer safety from the snarling beasts. Theon has only his bow, about which he thinks he needed nothing else. Once he had saved Bran's life with an arrow. He hoped he would not need to take it with another, but if it came to that, he would.
The hunters quickly locate the trail beyond the gate. It says Theon sees, quote, the paw prints of the wolves, Hodor's heavy tread, the shallower marks left by the feet of the two Reeds. He fails to notice any tracks that might be from Osha or Rickon, but doesn't seem too concerned, as the initial trail soon leads into the stony ground of the Wolfswood, and the business of tracking falls to Farland's dogs.
As they make their way through the dense wood, Luwin approaches him to plead for mercy for the children, Bran and Rickon, and the Reeds as well, pointing out that Howland Reed's children are nearly as valuable as hostages as the Starks are. He also points out that Hodor is an innocent who merely does what he's told, but is unable to make any excuse for Osha. Theon agrees to the mercy, understanding on some level that he will eventually need more than force if the Ironborn are to hold on to their conquests in the north.
The hunting party follows the trail of the direwolves to a freshly killed elk carcass, clearly the work of Summer and Shaggy, but a puzzled Theon notes that it hasn't been butchered by humans in any way. Soon after, the trail intersected with a small but swiftly flowing brook, and the dogs lost the scent. It was Wex Pike who noticed that there were no human footprints on the bank of the stream, only the wolf prints, and a frustrated Theon realizes that Osha must have led her human charges away somewhere on the path behind them.
The rest of the day passed with their party broken up into smaller groups, searching for any sign of the trail that two adults, both carrying a child, and two other young people must have left. The reader will eventually learn that the humans had only gone as far as the edge of the Wolfswood before doubling back and sending the wolves on alone to lead their pursuers a merry chase. and the plan worked. It was a frustrated and enraged Theon Greyjoy who called a halt to the hunt as darkness fell, knowing that he would be mocked as a fool by Northmen and Ironborn alike.
But then Reek made this helpful suggestion to him. Might be them Starks never came this way. If I was them, I would have gone north and east, maybe, to the Umbers. Good Stark men they are, but their lands are a long way. The boys will shelter someplace nearer. Might be I know where. You know that old mill sitting lonely on the Acorn Water? We stopped there when I was being dragged to Winterfell a captive. The miller's wife sold us hay for our horses while that old knight clucked over her brats. Might be the Starks are hiding there.
Theon was at first too annoyed by Reek and his slyness to understand what was being suggested. But the serving man summoned him over and showed him the contents of his sack, a bundle of clothing and a silver and jet wolf's head brooch. When he saw the brooch, it says, "Understanding came suddenly." And so Theon swiftly ordered all of the Winterfell folk to return to the castle, while he would continue on with Reek and his Ironborn to the mill by the Acorn Water.
As Luwin went away, he entreated Theon to remember his promise to show mercy to the runaways, thinking, "It is better to be feared than laughed at." Theon's only reply was, "Mercy was for the morning, before they made me angry." And to fill in what happened next requires piecing together details from several chapters.
Reek had evidently noted that the miller had 2 children, roughly the size of Bran and Rickon, and so the small group made their way to the Acorn Water to commit a terrible act in the name of Theon saving face.
We'll eventually learn from Theon's thoughts how Gelmar killed the pleading mother with a blow from his long-handled axe, while another killed the 2 boys as Theon looked on. It was Reek who skinned the 2 small heads and dipped them in tar, while the others dressed the bodies in Bran's and Rickon's clothes that were in the sack Reek had carried all day. And so, one of Jojen Reed's greendreams, the one that had frightened Bran so much, came true after a fashion. Jojen had told him, "I dreamed of the man who came today, the one they call Reek. You and your brother lay dead at his feet, and he was skinning off your faces with a long red blade."
The disfigured heads along with the headless bodies would be brought back to Winterfell and claimed to be Bran and Rickon, to predictable horror and anguish. No one seems to have questioned what happened to the Reeds, Hodor, Osher, or the Wolves though, and curiously, Theon never thinks of them again.
Word of the atrocity would spread like wildfire around the war-ravaged realm and before long reach Riverrun and King's Landing. When his sister Asha finally arrived, she saw the heads above the castle gate and mocked her brother for killing children before begging him to return to Deepwood Motte with her. After he refused, she left him to his fate, which seemed pretty clear to her since Sir Roderick Cassel remained in the field, gathering men to retake the great fortress of the north. There's an irony to the fact that in saving face with a handful of castle servants, Theon lost not only the north, but the support of his own people, as will soon become abundantly clear.
In the aftermath of the murder of the miller's family, Theon is haunted by dreams. It will turn out that he had once bedded the miller's wife, and she, in particular, will feature in several horrific nightmares. Given that her youngest child couldn't have been more than 4 years old, there are even those in the fandom who wonder if Theon might have been the father and therefore be guilty of kinslaying. So far there's only speculation to go by, but it certainly would be a horrific added detail if true.
What does turn out to be true is that Bran and Rickon never left Winterfell at all. We know, too, that the ending of Jojen's greendream, as related to Bran and Mira in Bran 5, is that he saw, quote, "you and Rickon in your crypts, down in the dark with all the dead kings and their stone wolves." And as rereaders know, that's exactly what happened. And so, before we wrap up our look at Theon's Winterfell arc in A Clash of Kings, let's take a look at how George laid a number of careful hints pointing towards Jojen's dream being true, though not in the way one might have expected.
The hunt for the escaped children takes place in chapter 50 of A Clash of Kings. The next chapter is Jon 6, the 51st chapter of Clash. Jon in the far north with Corrin Halfhand captures Ygritte of the Free Folk, and when she learns he's a Stark of Winterfell, she tells him a story known to her people. It's the story of Bael the Bard, which we've discussed in the past, but its relevance to Bran's arc lies in its conclusion and in the fact that the story pops up in the chapter immediately following Bran and Rickon's disappearance.
Yeah, and that's because at the end of the Bael the Bard story, it turns out that the daughter of Winterfell, who had supposedly run away with Bael, the king beyond the wall, who had been at Winterfell in disguise, had never left the castle at all, but had in fact spent a year hiding in the crypts below her family's ancestral home. But while we can identify this as a hint with the benefit of hindsight, it's not entirely likely that many first-time readers will understand the significance. More hints are needed.
The second hint comes a further 2 chapters on. Chapter 53 is another Jon chapter, Jon 7, and in that chapter Jon has a curious dream. As his brother Bran often does, when Jon closes his eyes, he finds himself dreaming of wolves. Jon, clearly inside Ghost, can sense that his 4 siblings are far from him, scattered and alone, though he is unable to find their sense. He howls his sadness to the sky, and that's when he hears a voice say his name. Searching for the source of the sound, Ghost Jon finds a weirwood. It says, "It seemed to sprout from solid rock, its pale roots twisting up from the myriad of fissures and hairline cracks." The tree was slender compared to the other weirwoods he had seen, no more than a sapling, yet it was growing as he watched, its limbs thickening as they reached for the sky. Wary, he circled the smooth white trunk until he came to the face. Red eyes looked at him. Fierce eyes they were, yet glad to see him. The weirwood had his brother's face. Had his brother always had 3 eyes?
It would seem that the tree could hear his thoughts because an answer to his question came swiftly. Not always. Not before the crow. Ghost Jon sniffs the tree and it says he could smell wolf and tree and boy and something else too, something that disturbed him, the rich brown smell of warm earth and the hard gray smell of stone, and something else, something terrible, death he knew. He was smelling death.
But the tree senses his fear and tries to soothe him, saying, "Don't be afraid, I like it in the dark. No one can see you, but you can see them. But first you have to open your eyes. See? Like this." And the tree reached down and touched him. Jon wakes up then and is immediately back in his reality at the Skirling Pass. But the reader has just gained a huge hint that Bran is alive, somewhere in a dark place that smells of earth and stone and death. This takes place a mere 3 chapters and a couple of weeks after the deaths of the Miller's boys, and remember that the first-time reader will still be under the impression that Theon killed Bran and Rickon as he claimed.
In Theon's next point of view chapter, chapter 56 of A Clash of Kings, just 3 chapters since Jon saw Bran in the tree, we get a series of dreams, as we mentioned, and a confession. The chapter opens with a nightmare, and Theon thinks about having recurring nightmares since the day of the children's death. Memories of Gelmar killing the miller's wife and of dressing the small corpses in the clothes Reek had brought for them merge into a guilt-stricken horror for him, night after night.
And then his sister Asha arrives, and as she mocks him for killing children, many of the details are filled in through his inner thoughts. He thinks about the deaths of the 3 Ironborn who had accompanied him to the mill. The Ironborn can't keep secrets, they had to die. And the subsequent death of Farlan the Kennel Master, who he pinned the blame upon, likely because Farlan had had the most vicious response to the 2 little bodies. He remembers how Lewin had begged to take the bodies and place them in the crypts where they belong, and he refused, not in the crypts. and he thinks of kneeling in the bone and ash after he had burned the bodies and retrieving, quote, a slag of melted silver and cracked jet, all that remained of the wolf's head brooch that had once been Bran's. The following thought, he had it still, says an awful lot about Theon's mindset at this point in his conquest.
Near the end of the chapter, after Ash's departure, Theon has another dream. In this dream, he's in the Great Hall of Winterfell, and he thinks it's the welcoming feast from when King Robert had come. But it soon becomes dark and the noises grow discordant, and as he glances around, he realizes he's feasting with the dead. And here's what he sees. King Robert sat with his guts spilling out on the table from the great gash in his belly, and Lord Eddard was headless beside him. Corpses lined the benches below, gray-brown flesh sloughing off their bones as they raised their cups to toast, worms crawling in and out of the holes that were their eyes. He knew them, every one. Jory Cassell and Fat Tom, Porther and Kane and Hullen the Master of Horse, and all the others who had ridden south to King's Landing, never to return. Micken and Chael sat together, one dripping blood, the other water. Benford Tallheart and his wild hares filled most of a table. The miller's wife was there as well, and Farland, even the wildling Theon had killed in the Wolfswood the day he had saved Bran's life. But there were others with faces he had never known in life, faces he had seen only in stone. The slim, sad girl who wore a crown of pale blue roses and a white gown spattered with gore could only be Lyanna. Her brother Brandon stood beside her, and their father, Lord Rickard, just behind. Along the walls, figures half seen moved through the shadows, pale shades with long, grim faces. The sight of them sent fear shivering through Theon, sharp as a knife. And then the tall doors opened with a crash, and a freezing gale blew down the hall, and Robb came walking out of the night. Grey wind stalked beside, eyes burning, and man and wolf alike bled from 100 savage wounds.
A lot can be said and has been said about this dream, how it shows people that Theon not only knows firsthand to be dead, but believes to be dead. Robert and Ned and Jory Cassell and all the others who went south with Ned, though curiously the dream doesn't include Harwin, who, unbeknownst to the first-time reader and to many in the story, isn't actually dead. He also sees people like Benford Tallheart, the miller's wife, Farland, Micken, and Septon Chael, all dead far more recently and at Theon's hands. Then he notices Lyanna and Bran Stark and their father, Lord Rickard, along with the shadowy figures of other long-dead Starks. And at the end of his dream, Robb and Grey Wind enter the hall, and the words, "Man and wolf alike bled from 100 savage wounds," can be seen as a combination of Theon's extreme feelings of guilt and anxiety and foreshadowing of the Red Wedding, since Robb is still very much alive in the south at this point in the story.
But let's focus on two other individuals who, like Harwin, aren't in this dream and who, in fact, are not in any of Theon's dreams in A Clash of Kings. Bran and Rickon are notably absent from this Feast of the Dead, and this, combined with the hints in the Jon chapters, along with the numerous references to the crypts, should make first-time readers sit up and pay attention, because Theon's 5th point of view chapter ends with this bombshell. On their iron spikes atop the gatehouse, the heads waited. Theon gazed at them silently while the wind tugged at his cloak with small, ghostly hands. The miller's boys had been of an age with Bran and Rickon, alike in size and coloring, and once Reek had flayed the skin from their faces and dipped their heads in tar, it was easy to see familiar features in those misshapen lumps of rotting flesh. People were such fools. If we'd said they were ram's heads, they would have seen horns.
And so many of the hints and details of the preceding chapters finally make sense. Bran and Rickon aren't dead at all. Theon, at the advice of Reek, had substituted 2 other children in their place in order to preserve his own authority over the people of Winterfell. And while the first-time reader still has no idea where the Stark boys might be, the first part of Jojen's Green Dream about their fate has come true. As for the end of the story, Jojen's dream says it all. You and Rickon in your crypts. That dream, the story of the Stark girl hiding in the crypts with Bael the Bard, ghosts smelling earth and stone and death around Bran, Theon's refusal to allow Luwin to take the 2 small bodies into the crypts, all point in one direction, to one place.
Theon's A Clash of Kings arc ends with the inevitable arrival of Sir Rodrik Cassel with the army he had raised for the express purpose of rooting Theon and his handful of Ironborn from Winterfell. Unfortunately for Sir Rodrik, and Theon himself as it turns out, Theon had sent the man Reek south to the Dreadfort lands to seek men who would fight on his behalf. Those men arrived behind Sir Rodrik's force and cut them to pieces before being welcomed into Winterfell and doing the same to Theon's men. Winterfell would be torched and Theon taken captive and brought to the Dreadfort along with the women and children of the castle. Theon would not be seen again on page until more than 2 books and many months in story had passed.
Up next, we'll cover Bran's final clash chapter, where the secret of where he'd been hiding is finally revealed to those who hadn't caught on, and we get a first-hand account of what Ramsay Snow, the real identity of Reek as revealed in Theon 6 just a few chapters earlier, did to Winterfell after killing Northmen and Ironborn alike.
The ashes fell like a soft grey snow. He padded over dry needles and brown leaves to the edge of the wood where the pines grew thin. Beyond the open fields he could see the great piles of man rock stark against the swirling flames. The wind blew hot and rich, and the smell of blood and burnt meat so strong he began to slaver. Yet as one smell drew them onward, another warned them back. He sniffed at the drifting smoke. Men, many horses, and fire, fire, fire. No smell was more dangerous, not even the hard, cold smell of iron, the stuff of man claws and hard skin. The smoke and ash clouded his eyes, and in the sky he saw a great winged snake whose roar was a river of flame. He bared his teeth, but then the snake was gone. Behind the cliffs, tall fires were eating up the stars.
Like Bran 6, Bran 7 begins in Summer's POV. As Summer observes Winterfell, the great piles of manrock, from afar, his senses begin to inform us of the scale of devastation left behind by the Dreadfort men. Summer and Shaggy, it seems, have been hiding in the Wolfswood, and now from its border they can smell blood and burnt meat, and more specifically, men, horses, and fire. They've also heard the sounds of conflict, dogs barking, and horses and men alike screaming. And through a sky filled with ash and smoke, Summer sees tall fires eating up the stars behind the cliffs, which are the stone walls of Winterfell.
When the fires had at last burnt out through a gray and smoky morning, the 2 wolves made their way across the fields and through the devastated and empty winter town, right up to the walls of Winterfell. Nothing lived in the blighted landscape other than scavengers, crows, and wild dogs who fled before them. When they find a dying horse outside the walls, Summer and his brother finish it off and feed, and then we get the reveal of where Bran has been and the fulfillment of the final part of Jojen's Green Dream. Here's the passage.
The dark place was pulling at him by then, the house of whispers where all men were blind. He could feel its cold fingers on him. The stony smell of it was a whisper up the nose. He struggled against the pull. He did not like the darkness. He was wolf. He was hunter and stalker and slayer, and he belonged with his brothers and sisters in the deep woods, running free beneath a starry sky. He sat on his haunches, raised his head, and howled. I will not go, he cried. I am wolf, I will not go. Yet even so the darkness thickened until it covered his eyes and filled his nose and stopped his ears, so he could not see or smell or hear or run. And the grey cliffs were gone, and the dead horse was gone, and his brother was gone, and all was black and still and black and cold and black and dead and black.
Back in Bran 5, Jojen had told Bran the end of his vision. I saw the end of it. I saw you and Rickon in your crypts down in the dark with all the dead kings and their stone wolves. And as we laid out in the last segment, George laid many hints after Bran and Rickon's disappearance as to where they and their companions might actually be. And now, at last, their hiding place is revealed. They are hidden away in the crypts underneath Winterfell. Bran and Mira and Jojen and Hodor and Rickon and Asha are all soon confirmed to be there in the dark, where they've stayed hidden away for weeks, possibly as much as 2 months. And something that Bran said to Jon in Jon 7 is also confirmed. Bran has opened his third eye and has become adept at slipping inside Summer's skin from their dark hiding place.
Yeah, on this occasion, it seems like he's been gone 3 days, which may in fact correlate with the length of time Summer had spent observing the attack, man, horse, and dog noises, the fire, including the flames, eating up the stars, and the great winged snake, and the dismal and silent aftermath of burned bodies, ash, and gloom. Jojen warns him to take care and to remember who you are. When he's away with Summer, his human body is defenseless and completely lacking in nourishment, no matter how many times the wolf feeds.
Bran thinks about his third eye opening in the darkness and wonders if it's any surprise that he'd rather escape the darkness and the reality of his physical being. It says he could reach Summer whenever he wanted, and once he had even touched Ghost and talked to Jon, confirming the contact that occurred in Jon 7 near the Milkwater in the far north. Bran's thoughts express some irritation at Jojen calling him back, but as his thoughts clear, he realizes that he has valuable information and calls for Asha.
As Bran explains what's happening above to Asha, their position in the crypts becomes clear. The group of fugitives is gathered in the mouth of the empty tomb that waited for Lord Eddard Stark, beneath the statue that Lewin had commissioned after receiving news of Ned's death, way back at the end of A Game of Thrones many months earlier. Though Asha is initially reluctant, Bran momentarily touches Summer's mind and confirms the castle above them is a place of ash and death where no living thing moves.
After some brief discussion, the group decides it's time to leave their hiding place behind. And so, under the stone gaze of Eddard Stark, which Bran thinks is filled with sadness, quote, as if he did not want them to go, they make their way towards the spiral stairs that will take them up to the surface, to the door in the shadow of the first keep, the very tower from which Bran had fallen, and the very yard where he had landed and begun his journey as Bran the Broken all those months ago.
The way to the stairs takes them back in time, in a sense, down a row of past Lords of Winterfell whose stories get progressively farther from the present, meaning that the tombs of the most recently dead, Ned and his father and siblings, are located at the far end of the tunnel, with the darkness beyond awaiting future generations of Stark dead. Bran had always known that one day he would lie in that darkness, but now isn't so sure. If I go up, will I ever come back down? He wonders.
As they take their leave, Asha, Mira, and Bran take the 3 iron swords that had been laid in the 3 most recent tombs, Ned's and Rickard's and Brandon's, and then the group arrives at the stairs. While Asha goes up to check the door, Bran thinks about the stairs that lead further down, quote, to the deeper levels where kings more ancient still sat in their dark thrones, painting a picture of an underground warren, deep and dark, where no enemies could find them. Keep this image in mind because it will turn out that the place Bran arrives at many months later will be not dissimilar to these crypts of darkness.
As Bran thinks about taking courage from his ancestors, the Stone Lords on their stone thrones, Osha returns with a report that the door is blocked. At Bran's suggestion, Hodor tries the door, which is described as being at a slant to the ground, in much the same way that modern bulkhead doors leading into a cellar or underground area might be. After a lot of effort, the stone blocking the massive ironwood door shifts, and Hodor and Osha are able to clear the way for the others to exit the stairwell.
What they saw was a castle dead and burned, as Asha observed. An entire side of the first keep had fallen, and the yard they stood in was full of rubble, broken stone and cracked gargoyles, and even a dead body. As the small group stands absorbing the reality of what they've discovered, they're joined by Shaggy Dog and Summer, and then they go slowly in search of any food or useful items that might have survived the blaze.
Bran observes the destruction of his home, with everything that had been made of wood turned to ash and ember. While the granite walls were intact, inside they found the Great Hall had lost not only its massive oak doors, but its roof as well. The glass gardens were destroyed and the stables reduced to ash. A wall of the library tower that had once housed the workings of Winterfell's famous geothermal heating had cracked, allowing hot water to gush out and form a steaming lake in the courtyard. The bridge between the bell tower and the rookery was gone, as was the maester's tower itself and the sept, while fires still burned in the underground areas below the storehouses and the great keep, where Bran's family had had their living quarters.
Although the castle was completely deserted, except for a single dog and the ravens and crows, some of the bodies began to give hints as to what had happened. Bran recognizes Poxy Tim, one of the Winterfell guards, dead from an axe blow to the face. Asha is angry about the devastation, but she sees things Bran misses. Theon's horse, Smiler, dead in the stable yard, and then Black Lauren, whom Theon had left as his castellan while he hunted for Bran and Rickon in the Wolfswood.
Osha points out a curious tableau around Lauren's body. He had been brutally hacked to death, but the wildling woman notes that he took several foemen out before he died, and then points to the badge one of the dead men wore, a little man, all red, which Bran recognizes instantly as the sigil of House Bolton. But before they can puzzle out what it means, Summer howls and dashes off towards the Godswood.
Inside the Godswood, away from its enclosing walls, was untouched by flame and seemed almost peaceful. And under the spreading boughs of the heart tree, near its great black pool, they found what had attracted Summer's attention. Maester Luwin, face down in the dirt, a trail of blood behind him. Luwin was alive, though barely, and when they turned him to his back, he saw Bran and Rickon, and smiled, saying weakly, "The gods are good. I knew."
It turns out that the maester who knew his charges so well had noticed that the muscles in the legs of the Bran-sized body Theon had presented were too defined. Bran's leg muscles would have atrophied from months of disuse, while the miller's eldest son was presumably a healthy and active child. Expressing sadness for the poor child, Luwin wondered where the group had gone after their trail had disappeared in the woods, and couldn't suppress a chuckle when Bran told him, "We never went. Well, only to the edge, and then doubled back. I sent the wolves on to make a trail, but we hid in father's tomb."
Osha starts to plan how they'll carry the wounded man, but Luwin stops her, saying simply, "I'm dying, woman." Then he hastens to give her instructions about the boys. The princes, Robb's heirs, not together, do you hear? Asha sees the sense of that, but wonders where they should go. Luwin can only advise her where not to go, not to Castle Kerwin, nor Deepwood, nor Moat Cailin, nor Torrance Square, and certainly not east towards the Hornwood or the Dreadfort, where Ramsay's men will be patrolling. Perhaps the Manderleys at White Harbor, or the Umbers at Last Hearth, he suggests, adding, "I do not know. War everywhere, each man against his neighbor, and winter coming. Such folly, such mad, black folly."
With the final exhortation to Bran to be strong, Lewin says, "A good boy, you're your father's son, Bran. Now go." Then he turns to Osha and asks her for a drink of water and a boon. Osha understands immediately and tells Mira to take the boys out of the Godswood while she stays behind to give the old maester the gift of mercy under the watchful eyes of the weirwood tree.
Unbeknownst to any of the small party, there was another set of eyes watching them from the trees. These eyes weren't tree eyes or beast eyes, but human eyes, belonging to none other than Wex Pike, Theon Greyjoy's mute but extremely observant squire. Many months later at White Harbor, Davos Seaworth will be introduced to the lad whom the Manderleys and Robert Glover have learned to communicate with, and so the secret of Bran's and Rickon's survival will become known to men loyal to House Stark, and another honorable man who will be tasked with retrieving Ned's youngest son.
It was decided that Osha would take Rickon and Shaggy and follow the King's Road for a time, though whether north or south she does not say. Based on Lewin's advice, it might seem like she was planning to make their way towards White Harbor, but based on where it seems they ended up, not to mention Osha's own personal knowledge, it actually seems more likely that they headed north, perhaps intending to seek out the other location Lewin had mentioned, Last Hearth, at the edge of the New Gift.
Hodor would stay with Bran to be his legs, and the Reeds would follow him as well. And so, after a visit to the kitchens to take whatever food they could find there, the group splits in two. Osha and Rickon heading for the East Gate, facing the King's Road, and Bran and his companions heading west to the Hunter's Gate, facing the Wolf's Wood. After they make their farewells and exit the castle, Bran asks Mira where they should go, wondering if Greywater Watch would be their destination. But Jojen answers for his sister. "Our road is north," he says. And so the little group sets out, two slender children on foot, accompanied by a direwolf and a giant but simple-minded stable boy, bearing a disabled child on his back.
And so ends Bran's A Clash of Kings arc, and in fact so ends A Clash of Kings, as this chapter is the final of the novel, which has no epilogue. Whereas Bran's arc in this book has been largely defined by his and Jojen Reed's dreams, Bran was also placed in a location that initially had no other viewpoint characters, and so, even as his own life may have seemed quite stagnant and unchanging at first, following the upheaval he experienced in A Game of Thrones, Bran often served as a camera character, through whose eyes we were able to observe many things pertinent to the overarching story that we wouldn't have seen otherwise.
Those two themes, dreams and observing, will roar to the forefront once again in Bran's A Dance with Dragons arc. And in the third and final installment of this analysis, we'll start with his handful of chapters in A Storm of Swords, where we'll follow the group's northward journey and learn much and more about northern legends and culture, before moving on to the even fewer chapters he has in A Dance with Dragons, as we see just how far north their road will take them. Until then, we'll close this episode out with this final and very hopeful passage from A Clash of Kings, as Bran sets out on a journey away from the only home he'd ever known. At the edge of the Wolf's Wood, Bran turned in his basket for one last glimpse of the castle that had been his life. Wisps of smoke still rose into the gray sky, but no more than might have risen from Winterfell's chimneys on a cold autumn afternoon. Soot stains marked some of the arrow loops, and here and there a crack or a missing merlon could be seen in the curtain wall, but it seemed little enough from this distance. Beyond, the tops of keeps and towers still stood as they had for hundreds of years, and it was hard to tell that the castle had been sacked and burned at all. "The stone is strong," Bran told himself. "The roots of the trees go deep, and under the ground the kings of winter sit their thrones. So long as those remained, Winterfell remained. It was not dead, just broken. Like me," he thought. "I'm not dead either." Thanks so much for joining us today. As usual, we'll end the episode by giving credit where credit is due. Thanks to George R.R. Martin for all the dreams, and to Kevin MacLeod for allowing us to use his music in our production. And now we want to thank our patrons from the Castle Steel level. If you enjoy the podcast, consider being a patron, and you could be hearing your name here too. Our heartfelt thanks to Tori Loon, AJ, Aegon VI, Ellie B, Brennan, Casey, Cassandra, Lady Amalthea, Chris, Christian, Courtney, David, Darian, Dimitri B, Dennis, Lady Diana Dane, Eliza, Emily of the Eyrie, Ezra, Felix, Gerald Garcia, Sir Gladworth, Sir Gregor the Toasty, Lord of the Breadfort, Ingvild, Something Like a Lawyer, Jim McGeehan, Winter's King, Red Jimbo Rivers, John Aris, Rider of the Ice Dragon, Cenarion, the White Storm, Jordan, Arafinwe and Glorian, Judson, Katie, Kenneth, Tree Girl, Sir Galahoo of What, Anne Hayden Jones and her husband Pip, Lena Snow, known as the Twilight Star, Lemba, Lomas Knight Rider, survivor of the Yin Sleepover, Lord Leighton with the Highest Tower, Mage Marmont, Monero Geek TV, Maria, Margareta, and our cohort of Matts, Matt A, Matt C, Matt K, Matt L, Matt M, Matt R, as well as Beatrix Rainfall, Maester Mary, Molly, Nimble Nick One Iric, Peter Pebble, Paul B, Paul H, PJ, Peter, King Ray, first of his name, Richard, Rickle Pickle, Sam, Sir Swift the Peppered Knight from the House of Black and Grey, Sir Larsalot of B Hill, Cern, the Rat Chef de Cuisine, the Peppered Knight, Terry, Sir Terence, Knight of the Cedars, Steph Lioness, Chief Banker at the Wall, Warren Halfhand, and Yvonne. As always, let us know if I've pronounced any of your names wrong, if you have a nickname you'd prefer to use, or if you feel we've left anything out. Visit RadioWesteros.com for quick access to all our podcasts. You can also find a link to our Patreon campaign, donate via PayPal or Ko-fi, and comment on our content there. Or find us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, or wherever you find your podcasts. And of course, you can connect with us via Instagram, Discord, email, or Blue Sky. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you soon with a new episode. Bye for now.